Hey, welcome back. Or, if you're new here, welcome in. Before we begin tonight, if these quiet journeys into the past have ever helped you relax or drift off to sleep, a like and a subscribe help this little channel find someone else who needs it too. It costs you nothing, and it means more than you might think. While you settle in, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Maybe a peaceful evening in California, a quiet village somewhere in Northumberland, or a chilly winter night in Melbourne with your dog curled up nearby. Leave it in the comments if you feel like it. I really do read every single one. Now, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Let the room grow quiet. Let your breathing slow. Comfortable? Good. Let us begin. It is not the great hall of a castle we are walking into tonight, and it is not some picture book cottage either. It is something in between, and something far more ordinary and far more interesting for being ordinary. Picture a long, low building at the edge of a market road in England, sometime in the 1300s, its timber frame gone silver grey with age, its thatch sagging slightly at one corner where nobody has quite gotten around to fixing it. There is a painted sign swinging on an iron bracket above the door, a crude picture of a boar's head, because most people passing by cannot read, and a picture tells them everything they need to know before they have crossed the threshold. This is the boar's head. It has stood on this spot more or less for 3 generations. The light is going out of the sky in that particular way it does in late autumn, fast and a little apologetic as though the day is embarrassed to be leaving so early. Smoke is rising from the chimney in a thick grey column that smells of burning oak, and underneath that, if you stood close enough, you would catch the smell of roasting onions and something with fat in it turning slowly over the fire. The yard in front of the inn is churned mud, and it is busy. Genuinely busy, in the way a place gets busy right at the hour when the light fails and the road becomes unsafe to travel. Standing in the doorway, wiping his hands on a stained apron and squinting down the road, is Walter Fenwick, and he has kept this inn for 11 years, inheriting it from his own father the way you might inherit a bad knee or a stubborn chin. He's not the innkeeper of storybooks, jolly and round and endlessly amused. He is tired, mostly, in the specific way that comes from running a business that never really closes, but he is watching the road with the particular alertness of a man counting heads before dark, doing the arithmetic of how many beds he has left and how many travellers are still out there hoping to fill them. Behind him, moving through the smoke and the low orange light of the common hall, is his wife, Marjorie. If Walter is the face of the inn, the one who greets the road and haggles over the price of a bed, Marjorie is very nearly its entire nervous system. She keeps the accounts in her head, because she cannot read or write, and she keeps them better than any clerk with a ledger. She knows which guest paid last time, and which one tried to slip out at dawn owing for his ale. She knows, by smell alone, whether the stew needs more salt or has had entirely too much already. Right now she's directing 2 of the younger kitchen girls toward the hearth, her sleeves pushed up past her elbows, her voice pitched low and even, the voice of someone who has given this exact set of instructions perhaps 4,000 times in her life and has stopped finding it tedious, mostly, because tonight is never quite the same as last night. Their household is small, but it moves like something with far more people in it. Their son, 17 and built like a young ox, is out in the yard already, unhitching a merchant's tired horse and speaking to it in the low, nonsense murmur that people who are good with animals seem to know instinctively. Their daughter, 15, is inside, carrying a wooden trencher stacked with bread toward the hall, moving with the particular quick confidence of someone who has grown up weaving between adults twice her size without ever once being knocked over. There is an elderly aunt too, Walter's father's sister, who sits by the fire most evenings doing something with her hands, mending or shelling nuts, watching everything with the sharp, unbothered eyes of someone who has seen every kind of traveller this road has ever produced and is no longer surprised by any of them. And here is something you might not expect. An inn like this was not, strictly speaking, a business in the way we think of businesses today. Under English law at this time, an innkeeper had what was called a common calling. That meant Walter could not simply refuse a traveller lodging because he did not like the look of him, provided the man could pay and there was space. It also meant Walter carried a strange and heavy kind of legal responsibility for whatever happened under his roof. If a guest's goods were stolen while he slept, the innkeeper himself could be held liable for the loss. Think about that for a moment. Every single night Walter Fenwick was, in a very real legal sense, betting his own money on the honesty of every stranger who walked through his door. That is worth sitting with, I think. We tend to imagine the medieval world as lawless in a general hazy sort of way, all mud and violence and nobody watching. But there was a whole careful architecture of rules built specifically around the strange vulnerability of sleeping away from home, of trusting your body and your belongings to a room full of people you'd never met before that afternoon and would likely never meet again. Out in the yard, the arithmetic Walter has been doing resolves itself. A cart comes rattling around the bend in the road, driven by a man in a heavy wool cloak, and behind it walks a woman in a dark travelling gown with a small bundle clutched against her chest. And a few paces further back, moving at the unhurried, slightly swaying pace of a man whose feet are aching, comes a third traveller entirely alone. The man with the cart is Geoffrey, a wool merchant out of Lincoln, and this is not his first night at the Boar's Head. He has stayed here perhaps 6 or 7 times over the years, always on the same circuit between the market towns, always with the same wary, appraising look in his eye as he counts the other guests already gathered in the hall. Wool was, by an enormous margin, the wealth of medieval England. It funded wars. It built cathedrals. And men like Geoffrey, who moved it from farm to market to port, carried with them not just bales of raw fleece but real, portable money, coins sewn into hems and hidden in false bottoms of chests, which made them, whether they liked it or not, walking targets. Geoffrey does not sleep easily on the road. He never has. Nearby, the woman with the small bundle is Isabel, and she is not travelling with Geoffrey, though for a stretch of road they happen to walk together, the way strangers heading the same direction sometimes do. Isabel is a widow, and she's on pilgrimage, walking toward a shrine some day's journey further on, and she carries herself with the particular composure of a woman who has made peace with a great deal of loneliness and is not looking for anyone to notice it. We will come back to her. There is more to Isabel than the road knows yet, and the third figure, the one walking alone with sore feet, is simply a young man named Hal, a journeyman carpenter moving toward a job in the next county, and he is, at this exact moment, mostly thinking about beer. The boy leads Geoffrey's cart horse toward the stable, and this is worth a moment of your attention, because the stable of a medieval inn was doing quiet, essential work that had nothing to do with comfort or hospitality in the way we think of it now. A horse was, for most travellers, the single most valuable thing they owned, worth more than their clothes, their tools, and often their coin combined. Losing a horse on the road did not mean inconvenience, it could mean ruin. A man stranded days from anywhere with no way to carry his goods or himself onward. So the stable at the Boar's Head was built solidly, with a door that locked from the outside, and the son's evening duties included counting every animal twice, once when it arrived, and once before he went to bed himself. He knows every regular traveller's horse by sight now. He knew Geoffrey's horse was getting old before Geoffrey quite admitted it to himself. Inside, the common hall is filling with light the way a room does at dusk, when the fire finally gets ahead of the fading day outside. It is a single large space, the heart of the inn, with a hearth at one end large enough to roast a whole joint of meat, and smoke curling up toward a hole in the roof, rather than a proper chimney flue, because true chimneys were still, at this point in history, something of a luxury feature, more common in the homes of the wealthy than in a modest roadside inn. The smoke stings your eyes a little if you're not used to it. The regulars barely notice. Long trestle tables run down the centre of the room, benches on either side, and already there are perhaps a dozen people settled in, a mix of locals from the nearby village who have come simply to drink and gossip, and travellers who arrived earlier in the afternoon and are now well into their second cup of ale. The air smells of wood smoke, of tallow candles guttering slightly in the draught from the door, of wet wool drying too close to the fire, and underneath all of it, the rich, fatty smell of the stew Marjorie has had simmering since midday. The girl sets the trencher of bread down at the end of the nearest table, and here is a small detail that tends to surprise people. That bread is not really meant to be eaten, not entirely. Trenchers were thick slabs of stale bread used as plates, soaking up the juices and fat from whatever meat or stew was ladled onto them. The wealthy might eat the meat and leave the sodden trencher behind for the servants or the poor gathered at the door. At an inn like the Boar's Head, though, nothing goes to waste quite so easily. By the time a traveller finishes his meal, that bread has absorbed an evening's worth of flavour, and more often than not he eats every soaked, savoury bite of it. Because it is, frankly, delicious, and because leaving food behind when you have paid good coin for it would strike most travellers as a small kind of madness. Geoffrey settles himself at the far end of a table, near enough to the fire to be warm but with his back to the wall, a habit so old he probably could not tell you when he started it. His cart and everything in it is his to worry about tonight, and worry he will, at least for the first hour or so, until the ale and the warmth of the room do their slow work on him. Isabel, meanwhile, does something quieter. She finds a spot near the hearth, but slightly apart from the main press of the tables, and she sits with her bundle still against her, not because anyone has threatened it, but because it is a habit now, this small vigilance, this way of holding on to the few things that are hers. Now, here is a detail I find genuinely fascinating, and it is one most people have never heard. Medieval travellers, particularly women travelling alone or in small groups, often relied on a kind of informal unspoken network of trust that existed almost entirely outside any written law. An innkeeper's reputation was everything. Word of a dishonest or dangerous inn would travel along a trade route faster than you might expect, carried by merchants and pilgrims and carters who talked to each other constantly, comparing notes on which roads were safe, which fords were passable, which inns you could trust with your daughter or your coin, and which ones you could not trust at all. The Boar's Head had a good name on this stretch of road, which is precisely why Isabel chose it, and precisely why Geoffrey keeps coming back, season after season, year after year. And now, let us talk about beds, because this is where the story of a medieval inn tends to surprise modern listeners the most. If you had money, real money, you might get a private room at the Boar's Head, and there are perhaps 2 or 3 such rooms tucked above the hall, reached by a steep, narrow staircase that Marjorie insists on calling the ladder, even though it does technically have proper steps. These rooms are small, barely large enough for a bed and a chest, with a single shuttered window that lets in more cold than light, and a floor that creaks in exactly the same 3 places no matter how carefully you cross it. Geoffrey tonight has paid for one of these. He always does. It is not vanity. It is simply that a man who sleeps with a chest of coin under his bed prefers a door he can bar himself. Most travellers, though, do not get a private room, and this is the part that tends to make people's eyebrows go up. The main sleeping arrangement at an inn like this was communal. A large upper room, or sometimes simply a curtained-off section of the hall itself, filled with straw-stuffed mattresses laid close together, and travellers who had never met before that evening would, quite simply, share the space, and very often share the bed itself. 2 or 3 strangers stretched out under the same blanket for warmth and for economy, because heating an entire building was expensive, and bodies pressed together kept each other warm far more efficiently than any fire could manage alone. I want to be honest with you about something. When I first read about this, I found it almost impossible to picture without a kind of squeamishness. The idea of climbing into a bed with 2 total strangers, fully clothed usually, because most people slept in their day garments, or a simple shift rather than anything resembling modern nightwear. But the more I sat with it, the more it started to seem less strange and more, in its own way, remarkably pragmatic. There was no shame attached to it the way there might be today. It was simply how travel worked. You paid your penny, you got a place on a mattress, and who else happened to be on that mattress was, within reason, not something you got to choose. There were rules, though, unwritten but real. Men and women who were not married or related to each other were generally not placed in the same bed, and a good innkeeper like Marjorie took some care in working out the arrangement each evening, a kind of quiet, practical diplomacy that she has gotten very good at over the years, sorting travellers by trade and temperament almost as much as by sex, because she has learned through long experience that putting 2 loud, argumentative men on the same mattress makes for a bad night for everyone in the room. Hal, the young carpenter, will end up sharing tonight with an older wool comber heading home from market, a man who snores, as it happens, powerfully and without apology, and Hal will spend a good portion of the night with a corner of the blanket pulled up over one ear, which is, honestly, Exactly the kind of small, timeless indignity of shared travel that makes history feel suddenly very close and very human. The mattresses themselves were called pallets, and they were stuffed with straw, sometimes with a layer of dried bracken or heather underneath for a bit more cushioning, and refreshed periodically, though perhaps not as often as a modern guest would prefer to imagine. A good inn changed its straw regularly and kept the vermin down as best it could, with sweet-smelling herbs scattered among the bedding, dried lavender or meadowsweet, which served the double purpose of masking less pleasant smells and, they believed, discouraging fleas, a belief that had rather more truth to it than you might expect, since several of those herbs do genuinely have mild insect-repelling properties. Here is a small, curious fact I love. The word dormitory, the very word we still use today, comes from the Latin for sleeping place, and the layout of a large communal inn-room, rows of low beds under one roof, is a direct ancestor of the college dormitories and army barracks that would come centuries later. In a strange way, when a student today complains about a noisy roommate in a shared dorm, she is echoing a complaint that Hal the Carpenter could have made, almost word for word, on this very night 800 years earlier. Outside, somewhere across the darkening fields, a bell begins to ring, slow and even, and every head in the common hall lifts slightly, an old automatic reflex. That is the curfew bell, ringing from the parish church a mile or so down the road, and it marks something that most people today have never had to think about even once in their lives, the literal official closing of the day. The word curfew itself comes from the old French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire, and that is exactly what it originally meant, a signal rung out across a town or village each evening, that it was time to bank your hearth fire, to smother the flames down to embers so they would not catch the house alight while everyone slept. Fire was, by a wide margin, the greatest fear of any medieval settlement built largely of timber and thatch. A single unwatched flame could take an entire street in a single night, and so the ringing of that bell was not some abstract gentle suggestion, it was a genuine matter of communal survival. But curfew meant more than fire safety. It also meant in most towns that the gates were closing, that watchmen would soon begin their rounds, and that anyone found wandering the streets after dark without good reason, and often without a lantern to light their way, could expect to be stopped and questioned, at the very least, and quite possibly detained until morning. Night itself, in a world without street lamps, without any artificial light beyond fire and candle, was genuinely, physically dangerous in a way that is difficult for us to fully feel now. Robbers favoured it. Wolves, in more rural stretches of the country, favoured it. And ordinary people, by long custom, simply did not move around after dark unless they truly had to. This is precisely why an inn like the Boar's Head mattered so much, and why its doors, once barred for the night, stayed barred. Walter will make his rounds shortly, checking the shutters, checking the stable door, checking the great iron-banded front door itself, and once that bar drops into its bracket, nobody comes in and nobody goes out until dawn, save for some emergency serious enough to justify it. There is a legal custom tied to all of this that I find genuinely striking, called hue and cry. If a crime happened, if someone raised the alarm in the night, every able-bodied person within earshot was, by ancient law, obligated to drop what they were doing and join the pursuit of the wrongdoer, shouting, raising the neighbourhood, chasing the offender through the dark streets or fields until he was caught or clearly lost. Failing to join a hue and cry when you heard one was itself a punishable offence. Imagine that for a moment, an entire community legally bound together as an impromptu, ad hoc police force the instant something went wrong, every sleeping household jolted awake and responsible, whether they liked it or not, for the safety of the road outside their window. It did not happen often, thankfully, not on a quiet stretch of road like this one, but everyone in the common hall tonight has heard the stories, has perhaps even taken part in a hue and cry once or twice in their lives, and there is a kind of low, unspoken comfort in it, oddly enough. The world outside the Boar's Head is genuinely unsafe after dark, but the world inside it, tonight, behind a barred door, with a dozen strangers who all understand the same unwritten rules, feels by contrast remarkably secure. Marjorie moves along the tables now, refilling cups from a large jug, and she pauses beside Isabel for just a moment. The way a good innkeeper's wife learns to do, a brief, unhurried check-in disguised as ordinary hospitality, is the ale to her liking. Does she need anything before the fire dies down? Small questions, but Marjorie has been reading travellers' faces for 11 years, and something about the widow's stillness has already caught her attention, though she says nothing of it yet. Up in his small room above the hall, Geoffrey is doing what he does every single night on the road, without fail, before he allows himself to relax even slightly. He is checking the chest. It is not a large chest, not much bigger than a loaf of bread really, bound in iron and fitted with a lock that took a local smith the better part of a week to make correctly, and inside it, wrapped in cloth to keep it from rattling, is the coin he has collected from 3 separate wool sales this circuit, along with a folded letter of credit from a merchant in London that is, in its own way, worth even more than the coin itself. He slides the chest under the bed, then pushes it further with his foot until it touches the wall, then, almost as an afterthought, drags the room's single stool over and sets it directly above the chest's hiding spot, a small, largely symbolic barrier that would stop nobody determined, but that lets him sleep, or come closer to sleep than he otherwise would. I find something quietly moving about that particular ritual, honestly. There is no lock, no stool, no clever hiding place that could truly protect a man travelling alone with valuable goods through unfamiliar country. Geoffrey knows this, and yet he does it anyway, every single night, because the alternative, doing nothing, feels unbearable, and because sometimes the ritual itself is the point, a way of telling your own nervous system that you have done what can be done, so that it will, eventually, let you rest. Letters of credit, like the one folded into that chest, were becoming increasingly important in this period, a way for merchants to move value across long distances without literally hauling sacks of coin the entire way, an early, elegant answer to precisely the kind of danger Geoffrey worries about every night. A merchant in Lincoln could deposit funds with a banking associate, receive a letter and have that letter honoured by a corresponding associate in London or further afield, the actual coin never needing to make the dangerous journey at all. It is in its way the direct ancestor of a modern bank transfer, and it is remarkable to think that its earliest, clumsiest versions were already circulating through the pockets of anxious wool merchants on roads exactly like this one. Down in the yard, a new arrival is causing a small stir. A cart has pulled in, driven by a man named Edmund, with his wife Joan beside him, and a small girl, perhaps 6 years old, wrapped in a blanket and half asleep already against her mother's shoulder. They are not travelling for trade or pilgrimage. Edmund has taken up a tenancy on a farm 2 days further along the road, a fresh start after a hard year on land that had simply stopped giving them enough to live on, and this is their second night away from the only village either of them has ever known. The son helps Edmund see to the horse, while the daughter runs ahead into the hall to let her mother know a family with a young child has arrived, because Marjorie, as a matter of long habit, always makes a small adjustment when there is a child in the house for the night, a warmer spot near the fire if one can be found, a bit of extra bread set aside without being asked for. Joan carries the sleeping girl inside and settles onto a bench near the hearth, and something in her shoulders loosens the moment the warmth of the fire reaches her, the particular total relief of a mother who has been holding herself tightly together on behalf of a small person for hours, and can, finally, for a little while, stop. Edmund, meanwhile, exchanges a few words with Geoffrey, who has come back down for his supper, and it turns out the two of them have crossed paths before, briefly, at a market some years back. And there is that small, pleasant surprise that travellers sometimes get, the world narrowing down for a moment to remind them how connected these roads really are, how the same handful of faces tend to circle back around each other again and again if you travel them long enough. Supper, when it finally comes, is not an elegant affair, but it is, in its own rough way, a genuinely wonderful one. Marjorie and the girl carry out the great pot from over the fire, a stew thick with barley and root vegetables, and whatever meat was to be had at market that week, mutton tonight, cut small and cooked down for hours until it falls apart at the touch of a spoon. The smell of it fills the hall before the pot even reaches the tables, and there is a particular hush that falls over a room full of hungry travellers in the moment just before the food arrives. A kind of collective anticipation that needs no words. Bowls are filled, or in the case of some of the poorer travellers, that trencher of bread does its duty, soaking up the rich broth. Cups are refilled with ale, brewed on the premises in a shed behind the kitchen, weaker than what you might picture, closer in strength to a modern light beer, and consumed by everyone, children included, in smaller portions, because in a world where water could not always be trusted to be clean, ale was often the safer, more reliable drink, its brewing process happening to kill off many of the microbes that plain water might carry. Conversation rises around the tables, the particular loose, easy talk of strangers who know they will likely never see each other again and can therefore say almost anything. Someone is telling a story about a flooded ford 2 villages back. Someone else is arguing, good-naturedly, about the price wool ought to be fetching this season, and Geoffrey, despite himself, gets pulled into that conversation, offering his own hard-won opinion with the particular confidence of a man who has spent his entire adult life thinking about fleece. Hal, the young carpenter, has found his way into conversation with the wool-comber he will be sharing a bed with later, and the two of them discover, over the course of the meal, that they share a distant cousin in common, a not uncommon occurrence on roads this well-travelled, where the same families tend to circulate through the same handful of trades and villages, generation after generation. And the little girl, awake now and fed, has wandered a few careful steps from her mother's side to watch the fire, fascinated by it in the specific, total way small children are fascinated by flame, and the elderly aunt by the hearth, without a word, shifts slightly to make room on the bench beside her, an old woman and a very young girl sharing a fire in comfortable silence while the adults talk business and weather above their heads. There is a rhythm to all of this that I find genuinely lovely to sit inside of. The medieval inn at supper was, in a real sense, one of the only places in this world where strangers of different trades, different regions, sometimes even different social standings, sat elbow to elbow at the same table and shared the same pot of stew. A wool merchant and a carpenter and a farmer starting over, and a widow on pilgrimage, all bound together for one evening by nothing more than the shared fact of being travellers who needed a warm meal and a safe place to sleep. It is a kind of democracy that the rest of medieval society, rigid and hierarchical as it so often was, did not really allow for anywhere else quite so naturally. Isabel eats quietly, near enough to the group to be part of it, far enough to keep her own company, and if you watched her closely, and Marjorie, passing by again with the ale jug, does watch her closely, you might notice that her spoon moves more slowly than her hunger would seem to warrant, that her eyes drift, every so often, toward the door, toward the dark beyond it, toward something that has nothing to do with the room she is currently sitting in. Let me tell you about what these travellers actually carried with them, because it says something true about what safety and comfort meant on a medieval road, and it is not quite what you might picture. Geoffrey's cart, tucked now under a canvas cover in the yard, holds bales of raw wool bound for a weaver several days further on, but tied to his own saddle, closer at hand, are the things he considers too valuable or too necessary to leave unattended even for a night. A good wool cloak, oiled slightly against rain, because a merchant who arrives at his destination soaked through and shivering is a merchant who makes poor deals. A small knife, worn smooth at the handle, used for everything from cutting bread to trimming a hangnail, carried by nearly every traveller on the road regardless of trade or station, not as a weapon exactly, though it could serve as one in a pinch, but simply as the single most useful tool a person could own. A tinderbox, flint and steel, and a bit of char cloth, because the ability to make fire was not something you assumed you would find waiting for you. And wrapped carefully in oiled leather, that letter of credit and a small purse of coin for immediate expenses, kept separate from the larger sum locked in his chest, a bit of old practical wisdom: never carry everything you own in one place. Isabel travels lighter, as pilgrims generally did, partly by necessity and partly by a kind of spiritual principle woven into the whole tradition of pilgrimage itself. Her bundle holds a change of linen, a wooden bowl and spoon, a small vial of oil for blisters and aching joints, and a badge, pinned to her cloak, from an earlier pilgrimage she completed some years back, a small pewter token in the shape of a scallop shell that marks her, to anyone who recognizes it. As a woman who has done this kind of journey before and knows its rhythms, pilgrim badges like these were collected the way a modern traveller might collect stamps in a passport, proof of where you had been, and worn openly, in part because a recognized pilgrim, marked as such, was, by long custom and no small amount of genuine piety among the general population, generally treated with a particular gentleness on the road. Fewer people troubled a pilgrim than troubled an ordinary traveller. It was not a perfect protection, but it was something. And then there is etiquette, the unwritten rules that govern a room full of strangers sharing space for a single night. Rules nobody wrote down anywhere, but that everyone in this hall somehow already knows. You do not ask a fellow traveller too directly why they are on the road, not right away. You let it come out naturally, in conversation, if it comes out at all. You do not comment on another traveller's accent or manner of dress, not even in curiosity, because the road is full of people leaving one life for reasons that are entirely their own business. If you are given the last portion of stew, you offer to share it before you eat it, a small ritual of generosity that costs you almost nothing and buys a surprising amount of goodwill. And when the fire begins to die down for the night, when it is time to move toward the sleeping area, you let the women and any children present settle first, a small practical courtesy that has less to do with formal chivalry and more to do with the plain fact that a room settles more peacefully when the most vulnerable travellers are not left standing about, choosing their spots last, in the dark. There are quieter rivalries too, the kind that spring up naturally among any group of strangers thrown together, and tonight it is Geoffrey and another merchant, a cloth trader passing through named Simon, who spend a good portion of the meal in a low, running argument about trade routes, each of them convinced his own preferred road between two market towns is faster, safer, better maintained. It is entirely good-natured, mostly, the kind of argument two men have precisely because they enjoy having it, and Marjorie, refilling cups nearby, has heard some version of this exact disagreement perhaps a dozen times over the years, always between two men who will, in all likelihood, never actually travel together to settle it. As the meal winds down and the whole begins its slow, contented settling toward evening, Marjorie finds a moment to sit, briefly, on the bench beside Isabel, not making a show of it, simply arriving there the way a woman who has run a household for 2 decades knows how to arrive places without seeming to have planned it at all. They talk about small things first, the road conditions further along. Whether the shrine Isabel is walking toward is much further now, a few days at most. Isabel tells her, if the weather holds. Marjorie asks, gently, whether she is travelling entirely alone, and Isabel says yes, she is, and there is a pause after that word, a small gap in the conversation that Marjorie, wisely, does not rush to fill. Isabel's husband died 18 months ago. She does not say this outright, not at first, but it comes out slowly, the way these things tend to come out late in the evening, with a stranger, over the low warmth of a dying fire, in a way that somehow feels safer than saying it to someone who will still be there tomorrow to remember that you said it. He was a tanner, she tells Marjorie, a good man, careful with money and gentle with their children, and he died of a fever that came on fast and took him within the week, the way fevers so often did in this world, arriving without warning and leaving without mercy, and there had been nothing anyone could do but sit with him and watch. What she does not say, not in so many words, but what Marjorie understands anyway, the way one woman understands another without needing every detail spelled out, is that the pilgrimage is not entirely, or even mostly, about the shrine at the end of it. It is about the walking itself. It is about having somewhere to put her body every single day, so that her mind does not have to sit still in the empty half of a bed that used to have someone else in it. I find this detail genuinely moving, and I want to sit with it for a moment rather than rush past it, because it says something true about grief that transcends any particular century. We tend to imagine medieval pilgrims as driven purely by devotion, by a clean, simple religious purpose, and for many of them that was largely true, or true enough. But pilgrimage was also, quietly, one of the only socially acceptable reasons a woman in Isabel's position could give herself permission to leave home entirely, to walk away from the house that held all her memories, to be for a few weeks simply a traveller on a road rather than a widow in a village where everyone knew exactly what she had lost and watched her, with kind but exhausting concern for any sign that she was not managing. Here on the road, nobody watches her that way. Here, she is just Isabel, a pilgrim with a pewter badge and a bundle and sore feet, and there is something in that anonymity that she has come to need more than she expected to. Marjorie does not offer advice, and this too is worth noticing, because it would be so easy for this scene to tip into something sentimental or instructive, a lesson about grief delivered plainly. She does not do that. She simply refills Isabel's cup without being asked, and says that the room upstairs, the small one, has an extra blanket if the nights have been cold, and that she is welcome to it tonight, no extra charge, and that is all. It is not a grand gesture. It is a small practical kindness, offered without ceremony, and somehow that is exactly the right size of thing to offer a woman who is not looking for anyone to fix what has happened to her, only for a warm place to rest inside of it for one more night. Isabel thanks her, and something in her shoulders eases, very slightly, the smallest fraction of an inch, the kind of easing that does not fix anything but makes the next few hours a little more bearable, and that, more often than we tend to admit, is the whole and entire purpose of hospitality. Not to solve anyone's sorrow, just to hold a warm room open around it for a night. The fire has burned down to a low, steady bed of coals now, and the quality of light in the hall has changed with it. Softer, redder, the shadows climbing higher up the walls. Most of the local villagers have gone home to their own beds, leaving the room to the travellers who will be sleeping here tonight, and the hall has settled into that particular late evening hush that comes over any gathering once the loudest voices have left and only the tired, easy ones remain. Walter makes his final round of the evening now, and it is worth watching him do it, because there is a whole quiet craft to it that a casual guest would never notice. He checks the shutters on the two windows facing the road, drawing the wooden bars across them. He checks the front door, the great oak slab of it banded in iron, and drops the heavy bar into its bracket with a sound that seems to settle something in the room, a kind of collective exhale, the world outside now formally and physically shut out for the night. He walks to the kitchen and checks that the banked coals there are contained, no stray embers near the woodpile, no forgotten candle left burning near the thatch. He checks the stable door, which the boy has already secured, and gives it a firm shake anyway, an old habit, trust but verify, the same instinct that makes a person check twice that they locked their own front door, even when they are quite sure they did. This nightly ritual, this careful, methodical closing up of a building against fire and against intrusion, was one of the innkeeper's most serious responsibilities, taken every bit as seriously as the cooking or the accounts, and in a way it is the thing that made everything else possible. A traveller could only truly rest, could only let their guard down enough to sleep beside strangers on a shared straw mattress, because they trusted that Walter Fenwick had already done this walk, had already checked every door and window, had already made the building as safe as one man reasonably could. There is something I want to mention here about warmth itself, because it shaped medieval life in ways that are easy to overlook now, living as most of us do in houses that hold a steady, even temperature regardless of the season. Cold was not a minor discomfort in this world. It was a genuine danger, particularly for the old, the very young, and anyone already weakened by illness or hunger, and a huge amount of daily and nightly life was organized, quietly and constantly, around the management of it. This is part of why the shared beds mattered so much, beyond simple economy. Body heat was warmth you did not have to pay for in firewood, warmth that required no tending through the night, and there is a kind of plain, unglamorous wisdom in a system that used the simple fact of human closeness to solve a problem that fire alone could not always solve on its own. The daughter moves through the hall collecting cups and bowls, and the elderly aunt has finally set down her mending for the night, folding it carefully into a basket she keeps by her chair, and the little girl, Edmund and Joan's daughter, has fallen properly asleep now, curled against her mother's side on the bench, one small hand still loosely holding a crust of bread she never quite finished. Hal stretches, the particular full-body stretch of a man who has walked most of a day and is only now feeling the whole accumulated weight of it settle into his legs, and announces, to nobody in particular, that he thinks he has found his bed for the night and intends to use it before the woolcomber's snoring can claim the best spot first, which gets a tired, genuine laugh from the 2 or 3 people still listening, the small, easy humour of people who like each other well enough after one long evening of shared stew and shared road. Before anyone settles fully for the night, there is a small ritual of washing that happens near the kitchen door, and it is worth pausing on, because it tends to overturn a common assumption people carry about the medieval world, the idea that nobody back then cared much for cleanliness. That was not really true, not at a well-run inn like this one. A basin of water sits near the kitchen, warmed slightly from its proximity to the hearth, and travellers take turns washing hands and faces before bed. A plain linen cloth for drying passed from person to person and rinsed between uses. Full baths were rarer, saved for special occasions or for households wealthy enough to heat the considerable quantity of water a proper bath required, but a basic evening wash, hands and face at minimum, feet as well for anyone whose boots had been on since dawn, was an ordinary, expected part of preparing for bed, not a luxury at all. Joan washes her daughter's face gently, the girl barely stirring, and washes her own hands and Edmund's as well. A small domestic choreography they have clearly performed together many times before, and there is something quietly lovely in watching a family maintain its ordinary rituals even here, even a full day's walk from the only home they have ever known, the small unbroken continuities that make a strange place feel briefly less strange. Herbs play their part here too. Marjorie keeps a bundle of dried mint hanging near the wash basin, and travellers are welcome to chew a leaf or two before bed, a simple ancient bit of folk practice for the breath and the stomach both, and there is a jar of something stronger, set aside for anyone who complains of an aching head or a troubled belly after the road, a tisane of chamomile and a bit of dried valerian root, steeped in hot water, offered without much ceremony, the kind of practical herbal medicine that every good innkeeper's wife of this era knew by heart, learnt from her own mother, refined over years of watching what actually helped and what did not. Isabel accepts a cup of the chamomile tisane gratefully, her feet aching properly now that she has finally stopped moving them, and there is a specific total relief in that first cup of something warm after a long day's walking that I think most of us, even now, even with all our modern comforts, would recognize instantly if we felt it. Now, here is a fact about medieval sleep that I find genuinely fascinating, and one that almost nobody knows until they hear it for the first time. It is very likely that most of the people settling into their beds tonight at the Boar's Head will not sleep straight through until morning the way we generally expect to today. Historians have found substantial evidence that medieval and early modern people commonly practiced what is sometimes called segmented sleep, a first sleep of several hours, followed by a period of quiet wakefulness in the deep middle of the night, sometimes an hour or more, used for prayer, for quiet conversation, for tending the fire, for simply lying awake in the dark thinking, before drifting into a second sleep that carried them through to dawn. This was not seen as insomnia, it was not treated as a problem to be fixed, it was simply understood as the ordinary shape of a night's rest, referenced casually in old letters and legal records and religious writings of the period, this quiet watch in the middle of the dark hours, treated as unremarkable as we might treat, say, checking the time on a phone if we happen to wake briefly at 3 a.m. today. I mention this now because I want you to know, if you happen to be one of the many people who wake briefly in the night and worry that something is wrong with your sleep because of it, that you are, in a very real sense, sleeping the way humans slept for most of history. There is nothing broken about you. You are simply closer to Isabel and Geoffrey and Hal tonight than you might have guessed. The stairs up to the sleeping loft creak in their 3 familiar places as travellers begin to make their way up, one at a time, carrying a single shared candle between them that will be snuffed the moment everyone has found their spot, because an open flame left burning near dry straw all night was a risk no sensible innkeeper permitted, no matter how many times a tired guest might wish for just a little more light to settle by. Up there, The loft itself is a long, low room under the slope of the thatched roof, close enough to the chimney that a faint warmth rises through the floorboards from the hearth below, though by the deepest part of the night that warmth will have faded to little more than a memory. Straw pallets line both walls, each one topped with a rough wool blanket, and a narrow aisle runs down the centre just wide enough for one person to pick their way carefully between the sleeping shapes without stepping on anyone. The smell up here is different from the hall below, less smoke and stew, more dry straw and wool, and the particular, not unpleasant mustiness of a room that has held a great many tired bodies over a great many years. Hal claims his spot beside the woolcomber, who is already half asleep, and already, true to Hal's prediction, beginning to snore, a low, rhythmic rumble that several of the other travellers exchange a small, knowing look about, the universal fellowship of people who have shared a room with a snorer before, and know there is nothing to be done about it, except make peace with it. Edmund and Jones settle their daughter between them, the three of them sharing a single wider pallet set slightly apart near the chimney wall, the warmest spot in the room, which Marjorie arranged deliberately the way she arranges these things every single night without making any particular show of the kindness. Isabel takes the small private room after all, the one with the extra blanket Marjorie offered her, and there is a particular privacy in that small space that she has not had in several nights of travel, a door, however thin, that closes between her and the rest of the world, a single narrow bed that is entirely, only, hers for these next few hours. Below, in the now nearly empty hall, Walter and Marjorie move through their own final private routine, the one they perform every night after the guests have gone up, when the day's performance of hospitality can finally soften into something plainer and more like themselves. Walter counts the night's takings by candlelight, murmuring the sums under his breath the way he has done for 11 years, and Marjorie banks what remains of the fire, arranging the coals into a careful low mound that will hold its heat through the night without risk, a skill she learnt from her own mother and will in a few years teach to the girl in turn. They do not talk much during this part of the evening. They do not need to. There is a particular kind of marriage that gets built out of exactly this. Thousands of shared, wordless evenings spent doing the same small tasks side by side, and if you watch them closely, you would see it in the easy way they move around each other in the dim hall, never quite colliding, always somehow already knowing where the other one is about to step. Outside, the son makes his final check of the stables, a lantern held carefully away from the straw, counting the animals one more time by the dim orange light, running a hand along Geoffrey's cart horse's flank, and finding it warm and settled, the horse's breath fogging faintly in the cold night air. He latches the stable door, checks it twice, and stands for a moment in the yard looking up at the sky, which has cleared somewhat, a scatter of stars visible now above the black shapes of the trees along the road. Before sleep properly claims the room, there is a quiet, murmured round of prayer that passes through the loft, not organised exactly, not led by anyone in particular, simply the natural, unforced habit of people raised in a world where faith was woven into the smallest corners of daily life. Joan says something soft over her sleeping daughter's head. The woolcomber, between one snore and the next, mutters something that might be a prayer, or might simply be a habit worn so smooth by repetition that it no longer needs conscious thought behind it at all. Isabel, alone in her small room, kneels briefly beside the narrow bed, her lips moving without sound, and whatever she asks for tonight, she keeps entirely to herself. I find something worth noticing in this, the way religious practice in this period was not separated out into its own special hour or its own special room, the way it might be for many people today. It simply lived alongside everything else, folded into the ordinary texture of an evening, no more remarkable in its own context than checking a lock or banking a fire. Faith, worry, exhaustion, gratitude for a warm bed after a hard day of walking, all of it tangled together in the same few murmured words before sleep. The Boar's Head itself has its own quiet history, one that Walter tells to curious guests sometimes, though not tonight, not to this particular group, who seem more interested in sleep than stories. His grandfather built the original structure, a smaller building than the one standing now, and Walter's father expanded it once trade along this road picked up, adding the second story where the sleeping loft now sits, jettied out slightly over the ground floor in the fashion common to buildings of this period, the upper level projecting a foot or so beyond the lower walls, a construction technique that both created a bit of extra floor space above and helped shield the timber framing below from rain running down the walls. Every part of the building is timber framed, oak beams filled in between with wattle and daub, a woven lattice of thin branches packed with a mixture of mud, straw, and sometimes animal dung, plastered smooth and whitewashed, a building method that sounds crude when described plainly, but that produced in skilled hands genuinely sturdy and long-lasting walls, some examples of which, in certain parts of England, would go on standing for centuries after every person currently sleeping under this particular roof had been dead for generations. Up in the loft, the room has settled into its own particular music now, the wool comber's steady snore, the soft creak of the roof timbers shifting slightly in the cooling night air, the occasional shift and rustle of someone turning over on their straw pallet. Hal lies on his back for a while, staring up at the dark shape of the roof beams above him, thinking, in the loose, unfocused way of a tired mind on the edge of sleep, about the carpentry job waiting for him 2 days further down the road, a new hall being built for a minor local landholder, good steady work that should carry him through the winter. Geoffrey, in his private room, does not fall asleep quite so easily. He lies with one hand resting, almost unconsciously, on the edge of the bed nearest the stool that sits above his hidden chest, and his mind runs, as it does most nights on the road, through the ledger of everything that could go wrong, a habit he knows is not entirely reasonable, not tonight, not at an inn with a name as good as this one, but a habit he has never quite managed to talk himself out of either. Eventually, though, even his particular flavour of worry loses its grip, worn down by the warmth of the room and the ale in his blood and the simple accumulated exhaustion of a full day on the road, and his breathing slows and deepens, and he goes, somewhere in the deep middle of the night, the kind of hour that has no name of its own, simply the long stretch between midnight and whatever comes next, Isabel wakes. She does not startle, there is nothing wrong. It is simply, as we spoke of earlier, the ordinary shape of a medieval night asserting itself, that quiet gap between a first sleep and a second one, and she lies for a while in the dark of her small room, listening to the building settle around her, a distant murmur of voices from the loft that might be someone else's version of this same wakefulness, the faint creak of a shutter shifting slightly against its latch somewhere below. Isabel thinks of her husband, not with the raw, jagged grief of the earliest months, which has softened now into something closer to a bruise you have simply learnt to live around, but with a kind of quiet, ordinary tenderness, remembering some small, unremarkable detail of an evening years back, nothing dramatic, just the particular way he used to hum tunelessly while he worked, a habit that used to mildly irritate her and that she would now give a great deal to hear again for even one more evening. This is the part of grief that people rarely talk about, I think, the way it eventually stops being only sharp and starts, sometimes, to hold small pockets of something almost like warmth inside it, memory doing its slow, strange work of turning loss into something you can carry rather than something that simply flattens you. Isabel does not cry tonight. She simply lies in the dark and lets the memory move through her, gently, the way you might let a wave move past you in shallow water, and after a while, without any particular decision to do so, she drifts back towards sleep. Outside, further down the road toward the village, a watchman makes his slow rounds, carrying a lantern and a wooden rattle he will spin loudly if he spots any real trouble, though tonight there is nothing to spot, only the ordinary emptiness of a country road at deep night, hedgerows black against a slightly less black sky, an owl calling somewhere off in the fields, the ground crunching faintly with the first thin edge of frost. This is a season, autumn tipping toward winter, when travel itself becomes a small race against the calendar. Roads that are merely difficult in October can become genuinely impassable by December, rutted mud frozen into treacherous ridges, rivers rising too high to ford safely, and there is a reason so many travellers, Geoffrey included, push to complete their circuits before the season turns entirely, a reason inns like the Boar's Head see a particular kind of busy rush in these final weeks before the roads effectively close for the winter months. Much the way a modern airport gets busy before a holiday, everyone trying to get where they are going before the weather makes it too difficult to try. A wind picks up briefly outside, rattling the shutters just slightly, and somewhere in the loft, someone shifts and pulls their blanket a little higher without ever fully waking. And then the wind settles again, and the building goes back to its quiet, steady creaking, the sound of old timber holding its shape against the cold. The sound, if you have ever slept in a very old building yourself, that becomes strangely comforting rather than alarming once you have heard it enough times to know it for what it is, simply a house breathing. The little girl, Edmund and Joan's daughter, murmurs something in her sleep, a fragment of a word that means nothing, and Joan, half conscious herself, reaches over without fully waking and rests a hand briefly against the child's back until the murmuring settles, an old, automatic reflex that mothers seem to carry even through their own deepest sleep, some part of them permanently on watch, no matter how tired the rest of them might be. There is something worth knowing about how medieval people thought about dreams themselves, because it shaped in a small way how they moved through nights like this one. Dreams were not generally dismissed as meaningless noise from a resting brain, the way a great many people might casually think of them today. They were taken seriously, discussed, sometimes even recorded, believed by many to carry messages, warnings, occasionally even a kind of prophecy, particularly if they came during that strange, quiet stretch between first sleep and second sleep, a time some medieval writers believed was especially suited to significant dreaming, the mind loosened just enough by a few hours of rest to become receptive to something beyond ordinary thought. Entire manuals existed, dream books, circulating in various forms throughout the period, offering interpretations for common dream images, a falling tooth meaning one thing, water meaning another, and while a great deal of it strikes a modern reader as pure superstition, there is something rather touching in the underlying impulse behind it, the same impulse really, that still drives people today to wonder what a particularly vivid dream might mean. The desire to find pattern and meaning in the strange, uncontrolled theatre that plays out behind our eyes every single night has not changed nearly as much as you might expect across 8 centuries. Down in the now silent hall, a small grey cat moves along the wall in the dim red light of the banked fire, unbothered by any of the sleeping travellers above, going about her own nightly business, which is, primarily, mice. Every good inn kept at least one cat, and the Boar's Head's cat, whom the daughter named some years back, and whom everyone else simply calls Cat, has more or less earned her keep many times over, a small, essential member of the household, who receives no wages and asks for none beyond the occasional scrap of meat and a warm spot by the fire, which she takes for granted as entirely her due. I want to mention something here about the word hospitality itself, because its history reaches back through exactly this kind of building, exactly this kind of night. It comes from the same Latin root as hospital and hostel and hospice, all of them descended from hospes, a word that could mean either guest or host depending on how it was used, a small linguistic detail that captures something true about the whole tradition, the way the boundary between guest and host was always meant to be a little porous, a little reciprocal. In the earliest medieval period, much of what we would now call hospitality was provided not by inns at all, but by monasteries and religious houses, where travellers, pilgrims especially, could seek shelter as a matter of Christian duty rather than commerce. The Knights Hospitaller, an order founded specifically around the care of sick and travelling pilgrims, take their very name from this same root, and though the Boar's Head is a purely secular, commercial establishment, run by Walter and Marjorie for profit rather than piety, it exists within a much older tradition of shelter for the travelling stranger, one that predates it by centuries and would go on to outlive it as well, evolving eventually into the coaching inns of later centuries and, further still, into the hotels that line modern highways today. The same fundamental human need, a safe bed for a tired stranger, wearing a great many different coats across a very long stretch of time. The woolcomber sleeping beside Hal has a name too, though nobody in this particular gathering has bothered to ask it, which is in its own small way a perfectly ordinary thing about travel of this kind. His name is Osbert, and he has walked this road perhaps 30 or 40 times over the course of his working life, carrying wool from farm to market and occasionally the reverse, and he has slept in more inns and barns and, on a few unlucky occasions, open fields than he could possibly count, and if you asked him, which nobody tonight has thought to do, he would tell you that the Boar's Head is, without question, among the better ones, warm and honest, the price fair, and the stew always properly seasoned, which is, in the end, most of what a tired traveller really asks of a place. Time itself moved differently through a night like this one, marked not by any clock most of these travellers would have owned, but by bells, ringing out from the parish church at set intervals through the night and day, the canonical hours, a rhythm inherited from monastic practice, and gradually absorbed into the wider rhythm of ordinary village life. Compline, the final office of the day, would have rung sometime after supper, marking, in a soft, unofficial way, the boundary between the evening's business and the night's rest. Matins, deep in the small hours, rang for those keeping vigil in prayer, monks mostly, though a farmer rising early for some urgent task might hear it too and use it, half-consciously, to gauge how much darkness remained before he needed to be up himself. Most of the sleepers at the Boar's Head tonight will not hear any of these bells at all, wrapped too deeply in sleep, but the bells ring regardless, patient and indifferent, marking a night that would pass in more or less the same shape whether anyone was awake to notice it or not. There is a particular quality to silence in an old building at this hour that I think about sometimes, a silence that is never actually complete, never actually empty. Even now, with every guest finally asleep, the Boar's Head is making its own small collection of sounds, the settle and creak of aged timber cooling as the last of the day's warmth leaves it, the occasional soft collapse of a coal shifting in the banked hearth below, the wind finding some small gap in the thatch and worrying at it briefly before moving on, a mouse, somewhere in the walls, going about business that cat has not yet discovered. None of it is loud, none of it disturbs anyone. It simply forms the quiet, ongoing hum of a building that is in its own patient, wooden way, very much alive. Walter and Marjorie have gone up to their own room by now, a small space at the far end of the loft, separated from the guests by a thin partition wall, rather than any real distance, close enough that they can hear, faintly, the general shape of the room's sleep, without being disturbed by its particulars. They do not talk long before sleep takes them too. There is a brief, quiet exchange about tomorrow, whether the bread will need starting before dawn given how many guests are staying, whether the boy should be sent to check on a delivery of grain that was meant to arrive earlier in the week and has not, the small practical accounting of a marriage built as much on shared labour as on any grander sentiment, though the sentiment is there too, underneath it, the way it tends to be in partnerships that have survived this many years of shared cold mornings and shared hard decisions. Marjorie falls asleep first, as she generally does, worn down by a day that started before dawn and will start again before dawn tomorrow, and Walter lies awake a few minutes longer, listening, out of long habit, to the specific texture of the building's silence, the way a person who has run a business for 11 years learns to listen for the one wrong sound among 100 ordinary ones. Though tonight, as on most nights, there is nothing wrong to hear, only the ordinary breathing of a full house settling properly into rest, and eventually he lets that ordinary sound carry him under as well. The girl, in a small alcove near the kitchen where she sleeps separately from the guest loft, lies awake a little longer than the rest of the family, not from any particular worry, simply the lingering, restless energy of a 15-year-old who has spent the whole evening working and has not quite spent all of it yet. She thinks, in the loose drifting way thoughts move just before sleep, about a boy from the village who smiled at her during market day last week, a thought that has nothing whatsoever to do with wool prices, or trenchers, or shared beds, and there is something lovely in that too, the way an ordinary girl's ordinary private hopes carry on quietly underneath the larger business of the inn, entirely her own, belonging to no century in particular. Let me tell you a little more about that painted sign swinging above the door, the Boar's Head that gives the inn its name, because inn signs like this one carry more history than most people passing beneath them ever stop to consider. In a world where the great majority of people could not read a single word, a sign had to work entirely through image, and inns competed in their own small provincial way to choose an image memorable enough to stick in a traveller's mind, distinctive enough to be described easily to someone else further down the road. Ask a stranger where to find lodging in this stretch of country, and he would not tell you the name written on a piece of paper somewhere. He would say, "Look for the Boar's Head," and you would know exactly what to watch for against the darkening sky. There was a whole practical logic behind this custom of naming and marking inns so vividly. Royal law during this period actually required certain establishments to display a sign at all, partly so that officials could identify where ale was being sold and ensure it met required standards, because ale quality and pricing were regulated with a surprising degree of seriousness. Local officials called ale tasters, and yes, that was a genuine, formally appointed civic position, would periodically visit inns and alehouses to sample the brew and confirm it was being sold at fair strength and fair price. An odd and rather wonderful little job to have existed in the historical record. A person whose actual civic duty was to drink the local ale and report honestly on its quality. The road itself, the one running past the Boar's Head, has its own long history, following, in this stretch, the rough line of an old route first properly laid by Roman engineers many centuries before Walter's grandfather ever laid the first timber of this building. Much of it has shifted over the centuries, worn wider by cart traffic, rerouted around a bad ford here or a collapsed bridge there, but the fundamental logic of it, the simple truth that it connects this market town to that one, has held remarkably steady across an extraordinary span of time. Travellers moving along it tonight are, in a very real sense, walking a path that people have been walking in one form or another for the better part of 1,000 years, market days and pilgrimages and wool carts, and eventually, centuries from now, though none of tonight's sleepers could possibly imagine it, motor cars. Tolls existed too, small fees collected at certain bridges and gates along particularly well-maintained stretches of road. The revenue meant, at least in theory, to fund the upkeep of that same road, an arrangement not entirely unlike a modern toll highway, though enforced with considerably more inconsistency and considerably more local variation than anything you would find today. Geoffrey grumbles about one particular toll gate a day's ride from here every single time he passes it, an old, familiar grumble that Osbert, lying near him in the loft, though neither man is currently awake to discuss it, would grumble right along with him if given the chance. The shared, easy irritation of two men who have paid that same toll more times than either cares to count. Outside, the weather has shifted further while the inn slept, the wind dying down almost entirely now, and in its place has come a fine, quiet frost, settling over the yard, over the thatch, over the black shape of Geoffrey's covered cart, a thin, sparkling layer that will be gone by mid-morning, but that, for these few hours, transforms the ordinary mud and timber of the inn-yard into something briefly, quietly beautiful, silver under a sky that has cleared enough now to show a scattering of stars directly above the chimney, smoke no longer rising from it, the fire banked too low now to send anything skyward at all. I want to take you into the kitchen for a moment, back before the fire went fully to embers, because the larder of a working inn like this one held its own small universe of careful planning, the kind of quiet logistics that made an evening like tonight's possible in the first place. Marjorie's brewing happens in a lean-to-shed built against the back wall of the kitchen, where a large wooden vat sits along with the other tools of her trade, malted barley soaked and heated until it releases its sugars, then strained and boiled with whatever bittering herbs she favours, since hops, which would eventually become the standard flavouring for English beer, were not yet in wide use in this part of the country during this period. Instead she uses a blend she calls Groot, a mixture that might include sweet gale, yarrow, and a touch of ground ivy, each brewer keeping her own particular recipe close, a small point of pride and reputation passed down, in Marjorie's case, from her own mother, who brewed for a different inn some miles from here before Marjorie ever married into this one. The beer she makes is weak by modern standards, low enough in strength that it could reasonably be drunk throughout the day by everyone in the household, children included, without much concern, and this matters more than it might first appear, because in a world where the safety of plain drinking water could genuinely not be relied upon, particularly in more populated areas where wells sat too close to middens and privies for real comfort. A weak, safe homemade ale was often the single most reliable beverage a household had access to, consumed at breakfast, at midday, at supper, as unremarkable a part of daily life as a cup of tea might be for many people today. A cool north-facing room off the kitchen holds the inn's larder stores against the coming winter. Sacks of dried peas and barley, strings of onions hung from the rafters, a barrel of salted pork, another of salted fish for the fasting days the church calendar required with some regularity, and a shelf of preserves Marjorie and the daughter put up together each autumn, fruit and honey cooked down and sealed with wax, meant to carry a bit of sweetness through the long grey months ahead. Provisioning an inn for winter was a serious undertaking, calculated carefully against the previous year's traffic, a guess, essentially, at how many hungry travellers the coming season would bring. A guess Marjorie has gotten quite good at making after this many years, though never entirely certain, because travel itself was always at the mercy of weather and war and harvest, forces well beyond any innkeeper's control. There is a belief from this period worth pausing on here, part of a broader medical framework called humoral theory, which held that the human body was governed by 4 fluids, or humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that health depended on keeping these 4 in reasonable balance. Sleep itself was understood through this lens, certain postures and timings believed to encourage a healthier balance than others. Sleeping on one's left side, for instance, was often recommended, believed to aid digestion by allowing food to settle more naturally in the stomach, a piece of folk medical wisdom that, remarkably, modern research on digestion and sleep position has found some genuine physiological support for, even though the underlying theory of 4 bodily humours has long since been set aside. It is a strange, small pleasure finding a thread of real accuracy running through a belief system we now consider almost entirely mistaken, evidence that careful, patient observation of the body can sometimes arrive at something true even without the scientific framework to properly explain why. Osbert, as it happens, sleeps almost exclusively on his left side, a habit he could not tell you the origin of if you asked him, simply something his own mother insisted on when he was a boy, passed down the way so much practical household wisdom was passed down in this world, mother to child, with no footnote, no citation, simply trust in the accumulated experience of the people who came before you. Pilgrimage, the kind Isabel is undertaking, was rarely as solitary an enterprise as her current stretch of road might suggest, and it is worth understanding the wider system she has stepped into, even for just this one quiet night between companions. Most pilgrims travelling any real distance tried to join a larger party for at least portions of their journey, both for company and for safety, groups forming and reforming loosely along the major routes the way water finds its way into larger and larger streams, a pair of travellers meeting another pair at a crossroads, 4 becoming 6, 6 becoming a dozen by the time they reached a particularly popular shrine. Isabel walked with such a group for the first several days of her journey, and will very likely rejoin one before long, since the shrine she is heading toward draws a steady stream of pilgrims this time of year, the roads leading to it well worn by generations of exactly this kind of hopeful, grateful foot traffic. There were guilds, too, in some towns, associations of pilgrims and travellers who pooled resources to fund things like bridge repairs or the maintenance of particularly dangerous stretches of road, a kind of early cooperative insurance against the genuine hazards of travel, and some wealthier patrons left money in their wills specifically for the upkeep of roads and the support of poor travellers, an act of piety that also happened to be, quite practically, an act of real civic infrastructure, centuries before anything like a formal highway department would exist to do the same work through taxation rather than charity. None of this touches Isabel directly tonight, sleeping alone in her small borrowed room with its extra blanket, but it forms the larger invisible scaffolding around her solitary walk, the reason a woman travelling alone through unfamiliar country in this period was not quite so exposed as it might first appear to a modern listener. The road had its dangers, real and sometimes serious ones, and no one would have pretended otherwise, but it also had its systems, its unwritten networks of trust and shared obligation, and Isabel has learnt over these past months of walking exactly how to lean on them without ever having to ask for anything directly. A little after the deepest part of the night, a soft rain begins outside, nothing like a storm, simply a light, steady patter against the thatch and the shuttered windows, the kind of rain that most of the sleepers upstairs will register, if they register it at all, only as a faint, pleasant sound woven into their dreams rather than anything that actually wakes them. The son, half surfacing from sleep in the small room he shares with his sister near the kitchen, hears it and thinks, briefly and without much urgency, that he ought to check the stable roof has not developed any new gaps since the summer, a thought that dissolves back into sleep before he has fully finished having it, filed away without quite becoming a decision, the kind of half-formed nighttime worry that will either resolve itself by morning or announce itself properly then, whichever comes first. The rain does the thatch good, in its way, settling dust, and the sound of it against the roof is, if you have never slept beneath a thatched roof in gentle rain, a genuinely soothing one, a soft continuous whisper overhead, entirely unlike the harder, more percussive sound rain makes against tile or slate, something closer to the sound of a held breath being slowly let out, over and over, for as long as the rain continues. Hull shifts in his sleep, pulling the rough wool blanket a little higher against the sudden faint chill the rain has brought with it, and beside him Osbert's snoring, remarkably, softens rather than intensifies, as though even his unconscious mind has registered the rain and found it, on some level, restful enough to ease its own noise a little in response. Let us talk about light for a moment, because the way this building was lit shaped almost everything about how its nights unfolded, and it is worth understanding just how precious a resource light truly was in this world. Candles came in two main varieties at an establishment like the Boar's Head. Tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, usually beef or mutton fat, were the everyday standard, cheap enough to burn without much thought, though they smoked more than their finer cousins, and carried a faint, not entirely pleasant smell of meat as they burned, something most people in this period simply stopped noticing after enough exposure to it, the way you stop smelling your own house after living in it long enough. Beeswax candles burned cleaner, brighter, and very nearly smokeless, but they cost considerably more to produce, since beeswax itself was a valuable commodity with plenty of other uses, and so beeswax candles were generally reserved for wealthier households, for churches, for special occasions, rather than for the ordinary nightly lighting of a roadside inn. The Boar's Head uses tallow, mostly, along with a good number of rushlights, a simpler and even cheaper option made by soaking the dried pith of rush plants in melted fat, then burning the resulting slender wick propped in a small metal holder. A rushlight burns for a relatively short time, perhaps 20 or 30 minutes depending on its length, which meant a household using them had to be genuinely deliberate about when and where light was actually needed, since replacing one required someone to get up and fetch another, an errand nobody undertakes lightly at the tail end of a long working day. This scarcity of light shaped daily rhythms in ways that are almost impossible to fully appreciate now, living as we do with a light switch in every room and street lamps outside every window. When the sun went down in this world, in any meaningful sense, the day went down with it. Work that required close attention, fine sewing, careful accounts, detailed carpentry happened during daylight hours whenever humanly possible, and evenings were reserved, by simple necessity, for the kinds of activities that did not require much light at all: eating, talking, listening to a story told aloud, or simply sitting quietly by whatever fire was available, watching the flames do the one thing fire has always done for tired people at the end of a long day, which is give them somewhere pleasant to rest their eyes while their minds slowly empty out. By now, the single candle that was carried up to light travellers to their beds has long since been snuffed, following the same careful logic that governs every open flame in this building at night, and the loft sits in a darkness that is, if you have never experienced anything quite like it, almost total, broken only by the faintest grey suggestion of moonlight finding its way around the edges of the shutters, enough to make out the general shapes of sleeping bodies if your eyes have had time to adjust, not nearly enough to read by, not nearly enough for anything beyond the simple, patient work of resting. Down below, in the hall, one small light does still burn, a single low rushlight that Marjorie leaves lit deliberately in a shallow dish of water, a modest safety measure and a modest kindness both, in case any guest needs to find their way to the door in the night, though it is set carefully away from anything flammable and will burn itself down naturally within the hour regardless, requiring no one to remember to put it out. I think about shelter a great deal when I write these stories, what it actually means, at the most basic level, to have somewhere warm and dry and reasonably safe to put your body down at the end of a hard day, and I do not think that need has changed even slightly across the centuries, separating tonight's sleepers from whoever might be listening to this right now. Geoffrey worrying about his chest of coin, Isabel carrying her grief quietly across an unfamiliar road, Hal thinking about tomorrow's work, Edmund and Joan starting over with a small child, and very little else. All of them, tonight, share the same simple ancient relief of having found a roof, a fire, a bed, and a door that locks. It is such a small thing to have in one sense, and it is in another sense very nearly everything. Edmund lies awake a few minutes longer than his wife and daughter, listening to the rain, which has softened now to little more than an occasional drip from the eaves, and he allows himself, in the particular unguarded honesty of the deep night, to feel the full size of what he and Joan are doing, leaving behind everyone and everything they have ever known for the uncertain promise of better land 2 days further down this road. It frightens him a little, if he is honest with himself, more than he has let Joan see. But underneath the fear there is something steadier too, a kind of stubborn, quiet hope that he recognizes, distantly, as the same hope his own father must have carried at some point, and his father before him, the ordinary, recurring hope of people who decide, against every reasonable caution, that a harder unknown is worth more than an easier familiar, if the unknown holds even a chance at something genuinely better waiting on the other side of it. He falls asleep somewhere in the middle of that thought, never quite finishing it, and that feels right, somehow. Not every thought needs an ending before sleep is allowed to take it. Geoffrey dreams, as he often does on the road, of wool, bales of it stretching further than he can see, an anxious, repetitive sort of dream that has more to do with the low hum of daily worry than with anything genuinely troubling, and somewhere in the middle of it, his hand, still resting near the edge of the bed, relaxes fully at last, the stool above his hidden chest no longer quite so present in his sleeping mind as it was in his waking one. Isabel sleeps more deeply now than she has in several nights, the small private room and its extra blanket, doing exactly the quiet work Marjorie intended when she offered it, and if she dreams at all tonight, it does not trouble her enough to leave any trace behind by morning. There is an old idea called guest right that ran through a great deal of medieval hospitality custom, older even than the specific commercial arrangement of an inn like this one, older than money changing hands for a bed at all. It held in its various forms across different regions and different periods that a guest who had eaten under your roof and slept beneath your protection was, for that duration, owed a kind of sacred obligation of safety, almost regardless of who they were or where they had come from. To harm a guest, or to betray one, was considered among the gravest violations of hospitality a household could commit, a breach not just of manners but of something closer to moral law. Traces of this older, deeper custom linger inside the purely commercial transaction happening tonight at the Boar's Head, even if none of the people involved would necessarily name it that way. When Walter checks that front door twice, when Marjorie quietly offers Isabel an extra blanket without charge, when the boy counts the animals in the stable one more time than strictly necessary, they are participating, whether they think of it in these terms or not, in a tradition of guest protection that reaches back long before either commerce or Christianity gave it a formal name. It is worth remembering, too, that this whole culture of the roadside inn did not stay fixed in the shape it holds tonight. Over the centuries following this particular evening, the simple traveller's inn would slowly transform into something grander and more specialized, the coaching inn, built to serve the new networks of horse-drawn coaches that would eventually crisscross the country on a fixed schedule, with proper stabling for teams of horses that needed regular changing along a route, larger common rooms, more private chambers, an entire industry growing up around the basic, unchanging need that the Boar's Head already serves perfectly well tonight. Later still, railways would create their own new geography of travel, and coaching inns near the old road routes would sometimes decline, while new hotels rose beside train stations instead, following the traveller wherever the traveller's actual path happened to lead. And later than that, of course, roads themselves would fill with motor cars, and something recognisably descended from tonight's Boar's Head, a roadside establishment offering a bed to a tired traveller passing through, would still be standing along nearly every significant route in the country, wearing a thoroughly modern face but built, underneath it, on exactly the same foundation. I find something quietly moving in that continuity, the thought that if you have ever pulled off a long highway late at night and been grateful, simply grateful, for a lit sign and a warm room and a door that locks, you have felt something extremely close to what every single traveller sleeping under this roof tonight is feeling right now, separated from you by the better part of 1,000 years, and yet joined to you by that same plain universal relief. The rain outside has stopped now entirely, and the clouds have thinned further, letting more stars show through, and the frost that settled earlier in the evening has deepened slightly with the clearing sky, since clear nights, paradoxically, tend to run colder than cloudy ones, the clouds having acted without anyone in the yard needing to understand the physics of it, as a kind of blanket holding the day's warmth a little closer to the ground. Kat, having finished her rounds of the kitchen and found nothing worth further pursuit tonight, has curled herself into a tight, comfortable knot on a folded sack near the last of the warmth radiating from the hearth, and there she stays, entirely still, for the remainder of the night. If you had stood at the crossroads near the Boar's Head on any ordinary market day, rather than this particular quiet autumn evening, you would have seen a far wider variety of the road's regular travellers passing by than happened to gather here tonight, and it is worth painting that broader picture for a moment, because it helps explain just how much genuine, constant human traffic a road like this one carried, century after century, long before anyone thought to call it a highway. There were drovers, men who made their entire living walking livestock, geese and cattle and sheep, over long distances from country pastures to city markets, sometimes covering journeys that took weeks, the animals themselves fitted, in the case of geese, with small leather boots, or their feet coated in a mixture of tar and sand to protect them across the miles of hard road, a detail that tends to make people laugh in genuine surprise the first time they hear it. Geese in little protective boots, plodding along in their hundreds behind a patient, weathered drover who knew every safe pasture and every reliable water source along his particular route the way a sailor knows the stars. There were minstrels and travelling entertainers, moving from fair to fair, from one lord's hall to another's, carrying news and songs and gossip along with their music, often the fastest and most reliable way information actually travelled between distant parts of the country, in a world with no newspapers and no post as we would recognise it. There were journeymen like Hal, skilled tradesmen who had finished their apprenticeships but had not yet settled permanently, moving between towns in search of the next job, the next master willing to take them on for a season's work, building up both experience and reputation with each new commission completed. There were royal messengers, moving faster than almost anyone else on the road, entitled by law to demand fresh horses at certain posting stations along major routes, carrying documents whose contents most of the ordinary travellers sharing the road with them would never know and had no particular right to ask about. And there were, of course, simple pilgrims like Isabel, walking for reasons ranging from deep personal grief to formal penance imposed by a church court, to nothing more complicated than genuine devotion, all of them converging, however briefly, onto the same worn ribbon of road, the same handful of reliable inns along its length. Fairs drove a great deal of this traffic, and they were by any measure enormous events in the yearly rhythm of medieval commerce, drawing merchants and buyers from remarkable distances for the 2 or 3 weeks a particularly large fair might run, transforming a normally quiet market town into something closer to a temporary city, tents and stalls filling every available field, entire specialized trades setting up shop for the duration, wool and cloth and spices and tools and livestock, all changing hands in an atmosphere that combined serious commerce with something close to festival. Inns along the roads leading to a major fair filled to absolute capacity in the weeks surrounding it, and Marjorie has already begun, in the back of her mind, thinking ahead to the fair scheduled at the larger market town 2 days from here next month, doing the same careful mental arithmetic she does every year. How much extra grain to lay in, whether they will need to borrow an additional cauldron from a neighbor to keep pace with the certain rush of hungry, tired travelers it will bring through her door. The legal framework governing all of this trade and travel had its own quiet, persistent architecture too, one that shaped even a small roadside inn like this one in ways not immediately visible to a casual guest. The assize of bread and ale, a set of royal regulations dating back generations before tonight, fixed acceptable prices and weights for these two most basic staples, adjusted according to the current price of grain, and inspectors, sometimes the same ale tasters mentioned earlier, sometimes separate officials, made their rounds checking that a loaf sold as a full loaf actually weighed what it claimed to weigh, that a cup of ale sold at the standard price met the standard strength. Manor courts, meanwhile, handled a great deal of the day-to-day legal business that affected ordinary rural life, disputes over land, minor debts, breaches of local custom, and Walter himself has sat on juries for such courts more than once over the years, part of the ordinary, unglamorous civic labor expected of a man of his modest standing in the local community. None of this touches the sleeping travelers directly tonight, wrapped as they are in straw and wool, and the particular unconsciousness of people who have walked hard and eaten well and settled somewhere warm. But it forms the quiet scaffolding underneath everything that happened this evening. The reason the stew was reasonably priced and reasonably portioned, the reason the ale poured generously rather than watered down to nothing, the reason a stranger like Isabel could walk into an inn she had never visited before and trust correctly that she would be treated fairly. The stars overhead have shifted their slow, patient arc across the sky in the hours since the last candle was extinguished, and if anyone in the village had reason to be awake and looking up, they would see the particular arrangement of this autumn sky, familiar constellations that medieval observers knew by names both similar to and different from the ones still used today, patterns people had been reading for guidance and reassurance for as long as anyone could remember. A kind of celestial constancy that must have felt, on a night this quiet, like the one truly unchanging thing in an otherwise uncertain world. Medieval astronomers and physicians alike paid close attention to the movement of stars and planets, believing them to exert real influence over health, weather, and fortune, a belief system we now call astrology, and generally set apart from the more strictly empirical science of astronomy. Though in this period the two were not nearly so cleanly divided, and a good physician was expected to understand the stars every bit as thoroughly as he understood the workings of the body. None of the sleepers at the Boar's Head are thinking about any of this tonight, of course. They are simply asleep, or nearly so, and the sky does its slow work overhead entirely without an audience, which is, in its own way, rather lovely too. Not everything beautiful requires a witness to remain true. Let me tell you a little more about what people actually wore to bed on a night like this one, because it is another one of those small details that tends to surprise people once they hear it clearly laid out. Most travellers at the Boar's Head tonight are sleeping in some version of the linen shift or undertunic they wore beneath their day clothes, rather than in anything resembling a dedicated set of night clothes the way a modern person might picture. Outer garments, the heavier wool tunics and gowns and hose, come off and are folded carefully nearby, both to keep them from wrinkling badly and because a traveller needs to be able to find and dress in them quickly if roused suddenly in the night, an old practical habit rooted in genuine, if usually unrealized, caution. Linen itself was valued precisely because it could be washed easily and often, unlike wool, which was far more difficult to launder without damaging it, and a household supply of linen shifts and undertunics represented a real ongoing labour of care, boiled clean in a large pot with lye soap made from wood ash and animal fat, beaten against stones or wrung by hand, then dried and, when the household could manage it, laid out in full sun, since sunlight itself was understood, correctly as it happens, to have a genuinely cleansing, whitening effect on linen fabric. Marjorie and the girl do this washing together every week or so, a task that takes the better part of a morning, and that the daughter, if pressed, would admit to finding tedious, though she has also come, without quite noticing when it happened, to value the particular quiet, companionable rhythm of it, the two of them working side by side over the wash-tub, talking about nothing in particular, the kind of ordinary, repeated labor that ends up quietly shaping a mother and daughter's relationship far more than any single dramatic conversation ever could. Some of the wealthier or more particular travelers do carry a dedicated nightcap, a simple close-fitting linen or wool cap worn to bed specifically to keep the head warm through the coldest hours, a genuinely sensible practice in an unheated room during an English autumn, and Geoffrey, practical man that he is, owns one and wears it without a trace of self-consciousness, tucked now snugly over his greying hair as he sleeps in his small private room. Children born at inns like this one, and the girl and the son both were, grow up inside a working household in a way that shapes them differently than children raised on an isolated farm might be shaped. From a very young age they are handling strangers, learning to read a traveller's mood and needs quickly, developing a kind of easy, practiced hospitality that becomes by adulthood almost second nature. The daughter has been carrying trenchers and refilling cups since she was barely tall enough to reach the tables properly, and the boy has been helping in the stable since before he could reliably lift a full bucket of water without spilling half of it. And there is a particular, unglamorous kind of education happening in all of that, a genuine apprenticeship in the family trade that will in time very likely see one or both of them take over the running of the Boar's Head themselves. The same slow, generational handing down of a livelihood that shaped Walter's own path and his father's before him. Hal's own apprenticeship, the one that has now given way to his current life as a journeyman carpenter moving from job to job, followed its own well-worn pattern, 7 years bound to a master carpenter back in his hometown, living in the master's household, learning the trade not through any formal schooling, but through direct, patient, repeated practice, mistake after corrected mistake, until the skills settled properly into his hands. He remembers the early years of it as genuinely hard, long days, a master who was fair but far from gentle with criticism, and he remembers too the particular pride of the day his master finally judged a piece of joinery good enough to stand entirely on its own, no correction needed, the closest thing to a graduation ceremony that existed for a boy in his position, and he thinks of that pride sometimes, still, on nights like this one, tired from a day's walking, but genuinely looking forward to the work waiting for him at the end of it. Edmund and Joan's new tenancy, waiting for them 2 days further down the road, is not, if we are honest about it, a guaranteed better life. Farming in this period carried its own long list of risks: a bad harvest, a sick animal, a landlord who proved less generous than his reputation suggested, and Edmund knows all of this perfectly well, has weighed it carefully in the months of quiet conversation with Joan that led them to this decision. But the land they left behind had grown thin and unreliable after years of hard use, and the new holding, by every account they have managed to gather, has better soil, a stream running close enough for easy access to water, and a landholder known, at least so far, for reasonable terms rather than grasping ones. It is a gamble, the way most significant changes in life tend to be gambles, weighed carefully but never fully known in advance, and there is something quietly brave in the ordinary way Edmund and Joan have made this particular gamble, packing what little they owned onto a borrowed cart and simply beginning to walk toward a future neither of them can actually see yet. Joan in particular has been turning over a small private hope of her own during these past 2 days of travel, one she has not fully spoken aloud even to Edmund, though she suspects he already knows the shape of it. She wants, more than almost anything, for their daughter to grow up with slightly more room to breathe than either of her parents had, a bit more land, a bit more security, perhaps even, if things go well enough over the coming years, the chance to learn her letters, a skill neither Joan nor Edmund possess, but that a landholder's steward at their new tenancy is known to teach informally to any child in the village bright enough and willing enough to sit still for it. It is a small hope, modest by any grand measure, but Joan carries it carefully, the way a person carries something they are not yet ready to risk saying out loud, in case saying it too soon might somehow curse it. There is a particular kind of medicine chest worth describing more fully too, since Marjorie's small collection of dried herbs and simples represents a genuinely substantial body of practical knowledge, built up over generations of trial, observation, and careful passing down from mother to daughter, mistress to servant, neighbour to neighbour. Beyond the chamomile and valerian already mentioned for sleeplessness, she keeps dried yarrow for stopping minor bleeding, its old folk name, herbal soldier's woundwort, hinting at centuries of battlefield and workshop use alike. She keeps feverfew, used for headaches, and comfrey, sometimes called knitbone, applied as a poultice to bruises and minor sprains, its old reputation for aiding healed bone having some genuine basis in the compounds the plant actually contains. She keeps dried elderflower for colds, and a small, carefully guarded portion of dried ginger, imported from far further away than anyone in this household could accurately describe, expensive enough that she uses it sparingly, reserved mostly for settling a badly upset stomach when gentler remedies have already failed. None of this constituted anything like formal medical training in the way we would understand it now, and Marjorie would be the first to say so, quick to send for the village's actual healer, a widow named Cecily with a genuine and locally respected reputation for more serious ailments, anything beyond the ordinary aches and minor complaints she can handle herself from her own small store of herbs. But within its proper, modest scope, this kind of household herbal knowledge did real, measurable good, easing a great deal of ordinary suffering long before anything resembling modern medicine existed to offer an alternative, and a fair portion of it, chamomile for calm, ginger for nausea, yarrow for bleeding, has survived essentially intact into the present day, sold now in tidy packets in shops rather than gathered and dried by hand, but doing, underneath the modern packaging, precisely the same quiet work it has always done. The boar's head has stood long enough now, 3 generations and counting, to have hosted an almost uncountable number of nights exactly like this one, each one slightly different in its particular cast of travellers, and yet, underneath the particulars, remarkably alike in its fundamental shape. Somewhere in the accumulated memory of this building, if buildings could be said to hold memory at all, are thousands of other merchants who slept anxiously above their locked chests, thousands of other pilgrims who found a night's unexpected comfort in a stranger's small kindness, thousands of other families who paused here briefly on their way towards some uncertain but hopeful new beginning. Tonight's sleepers will move on tomorrow, and other travellers, entirely unknown to any of them, will take their places on these same straw pallets tomorrow evening, and the building itself will go on doing what it has always done, holding tired strangers safely through the dark hours, asking nothing more of them than a fair price and a bit of ordinary courtesy in return. By the hearth, the elderly aunt has her own long history bound up with this building, though most of the guests passing through tonight know nothing of it, beyond the vague, comfortable sense that she has simply always been there, a fixed and pleasant feature of the place, like the fire itself, or the Boar's Head sign swinging above the door. She came to the Boar's Head as a young widow herself, decades ago now, when Walter's father offered his sister a home after her own husband died, leaving her with very little, and she has lived here ever since, first helping to raise Walter, and now, in her own quieter way, helping to raise his children as well. A steady, undemanding presence woven into 3 full generations of this one family's life. She does not talk much about her own younger years, not because there is anything shameful in them, but simply because, as she has said once or twice to Marjorie over a shared evening by the fire, the past does not owe anyone a constant retelling, and some things are better held quietly than turned over again and again for other people's curiosity. What she will say, if pressed gently, is that she was married for 11 years to a good, ordinary man, a thatcher by trade, and that those 11 years, brief as they turned out to be, remain, even now, the measure against which she has quietly judged most of her own subsequent happiness, not because nothing since has mattered, but because a first deep love tends to set a kind of private standard that outlasts the person who inspired it. Watching a great many travellers pass through this hall over the years, she has developed in her own unhurried way a genuine skill at reading them, not unlike Marjorie's own sharper, more immediately practical version of the same instinct. Tonight, watching Isabel from her seat by the fire, the elderly aunt recognized something of her own old grief in the widow's careful stillness, though she said nothing of it directly, simply made sure, without being asked, that Isabel's bowl was filled generously, and that nobody crowded too closely into her quiet corner of the bench. There is a rhythm to the year itself that shaped travel and inn business alike, built around a calendar of feast days and seasonal markers that most of tonight's travellers would recognise instantly, even if their exact dates shifted slightly from what any modern calendar would show. Michaelmas, falling toward the end of September, marked a significant turning point in the agricultural and legal year, rents often due, harvests largely gathered in, many farm labourers' contracts beginning or ending around this date, which meant a noticeable surge of travellers on roads like this one in the weeks surrounding it. People moving to new positions, new tenancies, much as Edmund and Joan are doing right now, their timing not entirely coincidental. All Hallows, at the very end of October, carried its own older layers of custom bonfires and prayers for the dead intertwined in ways that varied considerably from region to region, and travellers moving through this particular stretch of country in the coming weeks will find villages preparing for it, a certain seasonal texture to the inns and markets along the way that shifts again once the season turns properly toward the deep quiet of winter. Geoffrey, in his own trade, carries something valuable beyond wool and coin whenever he travels, and that is news itself. Merchants moving regularly along established routes became, almost incidentally, one of the more reliable channels through which information passed between distant parts of the country. A piece of news picked up in a market town relayed, a few days later, to an innkeeper or a fellow traveller several days' journey away, long before anything like a formal postal system existed to do this work more directly. Walter always asks Geoffrey, on his regular visits, what news he has carried along with him this time, and tonight, over supper, Geoffrey mentioned a dispute over grazing rights 2 market towns distant that has apparently gone all the way to a manor court, and a rumour, unconfirmed but circulating, of an unusually good harvest further south this year, the kind of small, mildly interesting information that travelled this way, merchant to innkeeper to villager, forming a slow but genuinely functional network of news long before anyone thought to call it that. The kitchen hearth itself deserves a slightly closer look, because it was, in every meaningful sense, the true engine of the entire building, the single fire from which nearly everything else in the household's daily rhythm ultimately flowed, built against one solid stone wall, since even a building otherwise constructed almost entirely of timber needed at least this one section made of something that would not simply burn away beneath a constant heavy fire. The hearth is wide enough to accommodate the large iron cooking pot that hung from an adjustable hook, a simple but genuinely clever piece of engineering, allowing Marjorie to raise or lower the pot over the flames, depending on whether she needed a fierce boil or a slow, patient simmer. A smaller side fire, built into a shallow recess beside the main hearth, handled bread baking, a portable clay oven heated separately and used mostly on baking days rather than every single evening, since heating it fully required a real investment of fuel and time that made more sense done in a single large batch every few days rather than freshly every night. Smoke from the main hearth rose up through the hall itself before finding its way out through a smoke hole in the roof, a louver, essentially, a small opening fitted with a simple wooden cover that could be adjusted or closed depending on wind and weather, a system that strikes most modern listeners as remarkably primitive compared to a proper chimney flue. And it was, in a sense, though it is worth remembering that proper chimneys, common as they seem to us now, were still working their way through medieval building practice during this period, appearing first and most reliably in wealthier households and larger stone buildings, only gradually becoming standard even in modest timber structures like this one over the century or so that followed. Walter has in fact been saving, slowly and without much urgency, toward the cost of having a proper brick chimney built onto the kitchen end of the building, a genuine improvement he expects to manage within the next few years if trade continues at its current steady pace, and he mentions this plan sometimes to guests who ask about the smoke, half apology and half genuine pride in a future improvement he can already picture clearly, even though it has not yet arrived. Payment for a night's lodging happened, at an inn like this one, through a mix of coin and, less commonly now than in earlier generations but still not entirely unheard of, occasional barter, a traveller short on coin but carrying some useful good offering a fair trade instead, a length of cloth, a portion of whatever they were transporting, sometimes simply a promise of payment on a future pass-through, extended only to travellers Walter already knew and trusted from previous visits. The reckoning, as settling the bill was generally called, happened in the morning before departure, tallied by Marjorie from memory with the same reliable precision she brings to everything else in the running of this household. A running mental ledger that would put a formally trained clerk to shame, built entirely from years of practice and a genuinely sharp natural memory for numbers and faces both. There is an old story Walter tells sometimes, on quieter evenings, about a night some years back when a traveller tried to slip away before dawn without settling his reckoning, only to be caught at the very edge of the yard by the son, then barely more than a boy himself, but already sharp-eyed and quick on his feet, who simply stood in the gateway and refused to move until the man either paid what he owed or explained himself properly to Walter directly. The traveller, as it turned out, had genuinely intended to pay and had simply misjudged how early he needed to leave to reach his next stop in good time, a misunderstanding resolved with an apology and a properly settled bill rather than any real conflict, and Walter tells the story now, mostly with fondness, a small proof of his son's steady character rather than any real drama, the kind of story that gets a little more polished and a little more amusing with each retelling over the years, the way family stories tend to do. The floor of the common hall is covered in rushes, freshly laid down every week or so, sweet-smelling reeds and grasses cut from the banks of a stream not far from the inn, strewn thickly enough to cushion footsteps and to soak up the inevitable spills of ale and grease that a busy evening produces. Herbs get mixed in with the rushes too, dried lavender and meadowsweet again, along with sometimes a bit of dried mint, both for the pleasant scent they release underfoot and for their modest, genuine usefulness in discouraging fleas and other small pests that a strewn floor might otherwise invite. Old rushes, once they have gone flat and a little sour-smelling, get swept out entirely and replaced, a task the girl has grown skilled at over the years, judging by nose and by feel exactly when a floor has reached the point of needing fresh material rather than simply another layer added on top of the old. Furniture in the hall is simple, sturdy, built to withstand exactly the kind of hard, constant use a working inn subjects it to. Long trestle tables, their legs designed to fold or detach entirely so the tables can be cleared away when the hall needs more open floor space, rest on simple wooden benches worn smooth and slightly shiny along their edges from decades of travellers sliding in and out of their seats. A single larger chair, the closest thing the hall has to a formal seat of honour, sits nearest the hearth, reserved by long and entirely unspoken custom for whichever guest happens to be oldest or most respected on a given evening, or, failing any obvious candidate, simply left for Walter himself once the evening's real business has wound down. There are no proper wall hangings to speak of, nothing so fine as woven cloth from a great house, though Marjorie has over the years acquired a few simple painted cloths, cheerful, unremarkable scenes of hunting or harvest, that soften the plain timber walls just slightly and give the eye somewhere pleasant to rest. Travellers of this period paid close attention to weather signs in a way that modern people, insulated as we generally are from any real consequence of getting caught in a sudden storm, have mostly let atrophy. A particular reddening of the sky at sunset, a ring around the moon, the low, urgent flight of swallows before rain, the behaviour of livestock growing restless ahead of an approaching front, all of it formed a genuine, practically useful body of folk meteorology, passed down and refined through countless generations of people whose safety and comfort depended directly on reading the sky correctly. Osbert, in particular, has a genuine reputation along this stretch of road for predicting weather more reliably than most, a skill built from decades of walking this same circuit in every season, watching the same hills and the same particular quality of cloud that tends to precede a hard frost versus a gentle one, and Walter tonight asked him quietly over supper what he made of tomorrow's prospects, receiving in return a considered, confident prediction of clear, cold weather, good travelling conditions, which seems, so far, to be bearing out exactly as promised. There is a metaphor sitting quietly underneath all of this talk of roads and travellers that I do not want to hammer too hard, because I think it works better felt than stated outright, but I will mention it once, gently, and then let it go. A road in the end does not really care who walks it, a wool merchant, or a grieving widow, or a family starting over, or a carpenter chasing the next job. It simply lies there, patient, offering the same worn path to whoever needs it, asking nothing of any traveller beyond the willingness to keep putting one foot in front of the other. And an inn along that road does something similar, offering the same warm shelter to whoever arrives at its door as evening falls, regardless of where they have come from or where, exactly, they still hope to end up. There is something quietly comforting in that impartiality, I think, the sense that shelter, real shelter, does not ask you to have earned it in any particular way. It simply asks that you have walked far enough tonight to need it. The harvest that filled Marjorie's stew tonight was gathered only a few weeks back, and there is a particular satisfaction this time of year in a larder freshly stocked after months of watching supplies dwindle through the leaner stretch of late summer, barley for the ale and the stew both, peas dried and stored in sacks, onions plaited into long strings hanging from the kitchen rafters, all of it the product of a harvest season that demanded genuinely exhausting labour from nearly everyone in the surrounding villages, whole families out in the fields from first light until the last usable hour of daylight, cutting and binding and carting grain before an early rain could ruin weeks of careful growing in a single bad afternoon. The Boar's Head does not farm its own land in any serious way, beyond a small kitchen garden Marjorie tends for herbs and a few vegetables, but it depends entirely on the surrounding countryside's harvest for its own supplies, buying grain and produce from local farmers at prices that fluctuate, sometimes considerably, depending on how generous or how difficult the growing season happened to be. This particular year has been a reasonably kind one, by all local accounts, better than the two before it, and there is a certain collective, unspoken relief woven through the whole district because of it. A sense that the coming winter, while never exactly easy, will at least not be a genuinely hard one, not the kind that empties larders early and forces difficult choices about which mouths get fed first. Geoffrey's news of an unusually good harvest further south only adds to this general sense of modest, cautious optimism, the kind that people who have lived through harder years learn never to state too confidently out loud, as though naming good fortune too plainly might somehow tempt fate into reconsidering it. The daughter, drifting towards sleep in her small alcove near the kitchen, thinks briefly, in the loose way thoughts wander before sleep finally claims them, about the village Michaelmas gathering that happened a few weeks back, a modest local celebration involving a shared meal, some music from a fiddler who travels through every year around this time, and a fair amount of dancing that the girl, if pressed, would admit to having enjoyed rather more than she let her mother see at the time. A young man from the village who smiled at her during market day was there too, and there is a small, warm knot of anticipation sitting in her chest at the thought of the next such gathering, whenever it might come, an entirely ordinary teenage hope that requires no historical footnote at all to be perfectly understandable to anyone who has ever been 15 and quietly, privately hopeful about someone. Meanwhile, the son has begun thinking, in recent months, about what his own future at the Boar's Head might eventually look like, whether he will take over the running of it entirely some day, the way his father took it over from his own father before him, or whether he might, as a few of his friends from the village have started to do, try his hand at something else entirely, a trade of his own choosing rather than one simply inherited by birth order and circumstance. He has not spoken to Walter about this directly yet, the conversation still sitting somewhere in the future, half-formed, but he thinks about it sometimes on quiet nights like this one, doing his final rounds of the stable, wondering what shape his own particular life is eventually going to take, a question that, again, needs no historical explanation whatsoever to feel entirely familiar to anyone who has ever stood at the edge of adulthood wondering the exact same thing. There is a kind of quiet reciprocity that runs through the whole culture of hospitality this inn belongs to, worth returning to once more before the night settles fully into its deepest, quietest hours. Travellers who are treated well at a place like the Boar's Head tend to say so to other travellers further down the road, to innkeepers at their next stop, building, slowly and informally, exactly the kind of reputation that has kept this particular inn's beds reliably full for 3 full generations now. Geoffrey has recommended the Boar's Head to at least a handful of fellow merchants over the years, entirely unprompted, simply because it seemed the natural, decent thing to do, passing along something genuinely useful to someone else on the same difficult road. Isabel, when she eventually reaches her shrine and begins the journey home again, or perhaps continues onward to wherever her own path takes her next, will very likely do the same, mentioning to some other tired traveller somewhere further along a good inn on this particular stretch of road, run by a kind woman who offered an extra blanket without being asked and without making anything of the kindness at all. A mile or so further along the road Isabel will be walking tomorrow. There stands an old holy well, tucked into a fold of the hillside just off the main track, marked by a simple stone marker worn nearly smooth by centuries of pilgrim hands resting briefly against it in passing. The aunt knows the story attached to it well, has told it to travellers many times over the years, though not tonight, since tonight's guests seemed more interested in sleep than in local legend. The story goes that a holy woman, centuries back, long before anyone currently living could trace with any real certainty, blessed the well during a season of terrible drought, and that the water never ran dry again afterward, not even during the worst summers anyone in the district could remember, and travellers passing this way have stopped there ever since, some out of genuine devotion, some simply out of old habit, too deeply worn to abandon, to drink from it and leave some small token behind, a scrap of ribbon, a coin, a pressed flower, tied or tucked into the branches of an old thorn tree that grows beside the well. Whether the story is literally true in every particular, the elderly aunt herself would not claim to know for certain, and would tell you so plainly if asked directly, with the same unbothered honesty she brings to most things, but she would also tell you that the well has in fact never gone dry in her own lifetime, through several genuinely hard summers she remembers clearly, and that this alone, true story or not, has been enough to keep the custom alive, generation after generation of travellers pausing at the same spot, leaving the same small tokens, drawing whatever quiet comfort they need from a tradition that asks for very little and offers in return a moment of genuine stillness in the middle of a long day's walk. Isabel will very likely stop there herself tomorrow, without knowing the particular story behind it, simply following the worn path of countless pilgrims before her, and there is something quietly moving in that too, an old comfort being offered to a new griever entirely, without either of them needing to know each other's names. If you could somehow lift the roof off the boar's head right now, the way a child might lift the lid off a small wooden box to peer inside, you would see, laid out below you in the dim red glow of the last banked coals, the whole quiet architecture of this particular night. Geoffrey curled on his side in his small private room, one hand still resting loosely, out of long habit, near the edge of the bed above his hidden chest, though the worry that put it there has long since given way to sleep. Isabel in her own small room, breathing slow and even now, her grief tucked, for tonight at least, into something quieter than it has been in months. Hal and Osbert side by side in the loft, Osbert's snore rising and falling in its own steady rhythm that Hal, despite his earlier grumbling, has actually stopped noticing entirely, the way a person eventually stops hearing any sound repeated often enough through a long night. Edmund, Joan, and their small daughter curled together near the warmest wall, 3 bodies forming one small steady knot of shared heat and shared hope for whatever the coming days will bring them. Walter and Marjorie in their own narrow bed behind the thin partition wall, the son and the daughter each in their own small separate corners of the building, and the aunt by what remains of the hearth's warmth, and Cat curled tight on her folded sack, and even the horses out in the stable, standing quietly in their stalls, weight shifted onto 3 legs the way horses rest, dozing in that peculiar standing sleep that lets them wake and run instantly if the need should ever arise. All of this, every single sleeping shape in this building tonight, is happening, in some form or another, in countless other inns and cottages and manor houses scattered across the whole width of England at this exact same hour, the same fires banked low, the same doors barred, the same quiet, ordinary trust extended by strangers to strangers, by hosts to guests, across a landscape that has no way of knowing, from any single point within it, just how many other small, warm rooms are holding just as much quiet human hope inside them tonight. There is something almost dizzying in that thought, if you let yourself sit with it for more than a moment, the sheer scale of ordinary human rest happening all at once, invisible to itself, each small shelter believing itself, in whatever way a sleeping mind believes anything, to be simply one lit window in an otherwise dark and uncertain night. Let us slow down here for a while, because there is no reason left to rush through the remainder of this night. The story, in the sense of things happening, of decisions being made, of one event leading cleanly to the next, has largely finished its work now. What remains is simply the night itself, unfolding at its own unhurried pace around a building full of sleeping strangers, and I want to spend some real time inside that stillness with you, the way you might linger in a warm bath rather than climbing out the moment you have finished washing. Feel, for a moment, the particular weight of a wool blanket, the kind Hal and Osbert share in the loft, heavier than most modern bedding, coarse against bare skin but softened considerably by years of use, carrying a faint, not unpleasant smell of lanolin, the natural oil sheep produce in their fleece, never entirely washed out even after repeated cleaning, a smell that has become, for travellers who spend enough nights on roads like this one, almost synonymous with rest itself, the specific olfactory signal that says, somewhere deep and pre-verbal in the body, you can stop now, you are safe, you can let go. Feel the particular texture of straw beneath a pallet's thin outer covering, not perfectly smooth the way a modern mattress might be, a little uneven, a little rustling with every small shift of weight, but warm in its own way, insulating, holding a body's heat close rather than letting it drain away into cold floorboards below. There is a rhythm to settling onto a straw pallet that every regular traveller on this road has learned without ever consciously deciding to learn it, a particular way of shifting and resettling in the first few minutes until the straw beneath has compressed into roughly the shape of the body resting on it, after which, remarkably quickly, it becomes entirely comfortable, entirely forgettable. Simply the surface sleep happens on, no more remarkable to the person lying on it than any mattress is to anyone sleeping on it tonight, in whatever room you yourself happen to be listening from. Outside, in the deep clear cold of the yard, an owl calls once, twice, from somewhere in the trees along the road, a low resonant sound that carries easily across the still night air, and somewhere further off, answering it or simply pursuing its own separate business, a fox moves through the frosted grass at the field's edge, unseen, unheard by anyone but perhaps the horses, who shift very slightly in their stalls, ears flicking toward the sound before settling again, unbothered, back into their standing doze. This is the world going on exactly as it always has, entirely indifferent to the sleeping humans tucked inside their timber and thatch shelter nearby. The fox hunting, the owl calling, the frost deepening very slowly across the grass, a whole separate rhythm of nocturnal life proceeding around the edges of the human one, without either particularly noticing the other. In the loft, Hal has slipped into a dream now, the kind of loose, pleasant, only half-coherent dream that tends to arrive in the deeper stretches of sleep, and in it he is working, hands moving surely over a piece of oak that is somehow, in the particular illogic of dreams, already half finished before he has properly begun it. A door frame, he thinks, though the details shift and blur the way dream details tend to, and there is no anxiety in it at all, simply the quiet, satisfying sensation of skilled hands doing familiar work, a dream built from nothing more dramatic than genuine competence and a mind at rest. The small girl sleeping between Edmund and Joan dreams too, though hers, if you could somehow see it, would look like almost nothing at all to an outside observer. Fragments of colour and warmth and her mother's voice, the particular formless, sensory dreaming of a very young child, not yet old enough to build dreams out of anything as structured as a story. She stirs once, briefly, and Joan's hand finds her back again without either of them fully waking, and the small girl settles, and the dream, whatever shapeless comfort it is made of, continues. There is something worth noticing about the particular quality of quiet that settles over a building like this one in the very deepest hours, a quiet that is different, somehow, from the quiet of an empty house. An empty house holds its silence the way a held breath holds itself, tense, waiting, faintly wrong. A full house, asleep, holds its silence differently, softer, rounder, punctuated by all the small ordinary sounds of bodies at rest, breathing at different rhythms, the occasional shift of weight against straw, the faint involuntary murmur of someone caught briefly in a dream. It is a silence that feels, if you let yourself notice it properly, less like an absence and more like a presence of its own, a whole roomful of trust made audible in its quietest possible form. Marjorie wakes very briefly, somewhere in the deep middle stretch of the night, not from any disturbance, simply the light, habitual waking of a woman whose body has spent 11 years attuned to the particular needs of a working inn even in her sleep, a kind of internal watchfulness that never fully switches off no matter how tired she is. She lies still for a moment, listening to the building's familiar night sounds, the wind that has settled now to almost nothing, the faint creak of old timber, Walter's steady breathing beside her, and finding nothing amiss, nothing that requires her attention, she lets herself sink back down into sleep almost immediately, the whole waking taking perhaps less than a minute, barely a ripple across the surface of an otherwise deep and thorough rest. This kind of light habitual watchfulness, present even in sleep, is worth pausing on because it says something true about the particular burden and the particular skill of anyone responsible for a household full of other people's safety. Marjorie has trained herself over more than a decade of running this inn to sleep in a way that is genuinely restful and yet never entirely undefended, a middle state that took years to develop and that she could not fully explain to anyone who has not lived a similar kind of responsibility themselves. It is not anxiety, exactly, it is simply a kind of care that has become so deeply embedded in her that it no longer requires conscious effort to maintain, the way a mother's hand finding a child's back in the dark requires no conscious decision either, simply happens, the body doing on its own what the heart has long since decided matters. The frost outside has deepened further now, the yard entirely silvered under a clear, star-scattered sky. Geoffrey's covered cart rimmed with a fine, delicate crust of white along every edge, the mud beneath it frozen hard enough now to hold a footprint cleanly rather than swallowing it, and the whole scene, if anyone were awake to see it, would look, for these few hours before the sun eventually returns to melt it all away again, genuinely, quietly beautiful, an ordinary working inn yard transformed briefly into something that looks almost deliberately composed, though of course no one composed it at all, only the plain, patient chemistry of cold air and clear sky, doing what cold air and clear sky have always done on nights exactly like this one, for longer than anyone sleeping inside this building could ever properly account for. I think there is something worth sitting with in how often beauty this complete arrives entirely unwitnessed. A frost pattern nobody sees, a particular fall of starlight across a particular roof, existing fully and completely regardless of whether any human eye happens to be open to receive it. It happened this way, more or less, on countless other nights before tonight, and it will happen this way again, more or less, on countless nights after, the world quietly performing its own patient beauty on a schedule that has nothing whatsoever to do with anyone's attention, and there is something both humbling and, I find, genuinely comforting in that, the sense that the world does not actually need us watching in order to keep being beautiful. It simply is, whether we happen to notice or not, and that fact alone, once you really let it settle, tends to loosen something in the chest that you did not entirely realize was held tight. Isabel's shrine, waiting for her some days still down the road, holds its own particular rituals, ones she has performed before on an earlier pilgrimage some years back, and will perform again once she finally arrives. Pilgrims approaching the shrine traditionally cover the last short stretch on foot, even if they have ridden for portions of the longer journey, a final small act of physical devotion before arrival. Once there, the custom is to wait, sometimes for a considerable while, if the shrine is a popular one, for a chance to approach the relic or image at its center, to kneel, to offer a prayer specific to whatever grief or hope brought that particular pilgrim on the journey in the first place, and often to light a candle, a small, physical offering meant to represent the prayer itself continuing to burn even after the pilgrim has risen and stepped aside for the next person waiting behind them. Isabel intends, when she finally reaches this particular shrine, to light 2 candles rather than the customary one, a small private variation on the ritual that she has not discussed with anyone, not even Marjorie in their brief evening conversation. 1 candle for the prayer she came to offer, and 1, quietly, simply for her husband himself, not a request for anything in particular, just a small physical acknowledgement that he existed, that he mattered, that his absence continues to shape every single day of her life even now, 18 months on, even as the sharpest edges of that absence have begun, slowly, to soften into something she can carry, rather than something that simply flattens her. There is a kind of safe conduct that operated for certain travellers during this period too. Formal or semi-formal guarantees of protection extended to merchants and other travellers moving through potentially hostile or unstable territory, sometimes granted directly by a local lord or by royal authority, sometimes arranged more informally through merchant guilds that had negotiated standing agreements covering their members along particular trade routes. Geoffrey's own guild membership back in Lincoln affords him a version of this protection, a recognised status that, in theory at least, obligates local authorities along his regular routes to take any harm done to him or his goods rather more seriously than they might treat harm done to an unaffiliated traveller, a form of collective bargaining power built up over generations by merchants who understood correctly that a lone trader had far less leverage than an organised body of them acting together. None of this is on Geoffrey's mind tonight, asleep as he is, but it forms part of the quiet, invisible scaffolding that makes his repeated journeys along this particular road possible at all. Layer upon layer of formal and informal protection, legal obligation, and simple community reputation, stacked carefully enough over generations that a man can fall asleep in a strange inn with a fortune in coin beneath his bed and wake, most mornings, to find it exactly where he left it. The night has grown very still now, the kind of stillness that has no particular hour attached to it, simply the deep, settled middle distance between the last of the evening's activity and whatever the coming day will eventually bring. The frost continues its slow work outside, deepening very gradually across the yard and the fields beyond, and inside, the whole building has settled into that fullest, quietest register of collective sleep, every sleeper sunk down into whatever stretch of their own night's rest they currently occupy. The woolcomber's snore, the child's small murmurs, Geoffrey's loosened hand, Isabel's slow, even breath, all of it woven together into the single, entirely ordinary miracle of an inn full of strangers resting safely through the dark. Let me tell you a little about wool itself, since it sits at the centre of so much of tonight's story, carried in Geoffrey's cart, discussed at length over supper, forming the literal economic backbone of an enormous amount of medieval English life. The journey from a living sheep's back to a finished bolt of cloth was a genuinely long and labour-intensive one, and Geoffrey's own part in it, buying raw fleece from farmers and moving it toward the weavers and cloth merchants further along the trade chain, represented only one link in a considerably longer process. Sheep were sheared once a year, generally in early summer, the raw fleece then sorted by quality, washed to remove the natural grease and dirt, carded or combed to align the fibres, a task Osbert himself specialises in, spun into yarn, most often by women working at a spindle, or, increasingly during this period, a spinning wheel, and finally woven into cloth on a loom, before the finished fabric went through additional processes of fulling, to thicken and felt it, and dyeing, to give it whatever colour the eventual market demanded. Every single stage of that long chain supported its own community of skilled workers and an enormous amount of medieval England's actual wealth, the money that eventually built cathedrals and funded wars and financed the very roads and inns that Geoffrey depends on for his own livelihood, flowed from this one remarkably ordinary-looking material, the coarse, greasy fleece of an unremarkable sheep, transformed through patient human labour into something valuable enough to be worth defending with locked chests and guild protections and merchants who slept, most nights, with one careful hand resting near their hidden coin. Inns across England carried an enormous, genuinely delightful variety of names during this period, and for centuries afterward, and it is worth taking a small detour into that variety before we let this night finish settling, because it says something charming about the particular character of the people who named them. Some names, like the Boar's Head, referenced heraldry or hunting, easily recognised images that required no explanation. Others referenced religious themes, an angel or a cross or a mitre, safe, respectable choices that also, quite practically, signalled a certain trustworthiness to travellers who might otherwise hesitate to lodge somewhere unfamiliar. Still others carried names that have puzzled historians for generations, Curious phrases whose original meaning has been lost or garbled over centuries of retelling, signs repainted again and again by successive innkeepers who kept the traditional name without necessarily understanding any more exactly where it came from. There is something quietly moving in that too. The thought of a tradition surviving intact long after its original reasoning has simply slipped away, kept alive not because anyone remembers why, but because it has always been kept alive, and that, on its own, has become reason enough. The elderly aunt, by the last of the fire's warmth, has her own small nightly ritual before sleep finally claims her too, a habit she has kept for as long as anyone in the household can remember. She keeps a small smooth stone in her apron pocket, worn nearly round by decades of handling, one her own late husband gave her not long after they were married, meaning nothing in particular that she has ever explained to anyone, simply a stone he picked up one afternoon and pressed into her hand because, he told her at the time, it seemed like it belonged to her somehow. She holds it for a few moments each night before sleep, not out of any particular superstition, simply because the weight and shape of it in her palm has become, across all these years, a small physical anchor to a memory she has no wish to ever let go entirely soft and vague. Tonight, as every night, she holds it, feels its familiar smoothness, and lets her hand relax around it as sleep finally, gently arrives. Telling time through the deep hours of a night like this one relied on tools considerably simpler than anything we would recognize today, and yet remarkably effective within their own limits. Some households of slightly greater means than the Boar's Head kept a candle clock, a specially marked candle with evenly spaced lines burned down at a roughly predictable rate, allowing a household to estimate within reason how much of the night had passed by how far the candle had burned. Others used a simple hourglass, sand trickling steadily from one glass bulb to another, though a proper hourglass was still, during this period, a relatively costly item, more common on ships and in monasteries, where precise timekeeping mattered more urgently than in an ordinary roadside inn. Most people, most nights, simply relied on the older, more universal methods available to anyone willing to step outside and look up. The position of particular stars relative to the horizon, the crow of a rooster somewhere in the village signalling the approach of dawn long before any real light appeared in the sky, the particular quality of birdsong that gradually built from a single early riser into the fuller dawn chorus as the true morning finally arrived. None of that fuller chorus has begun yet tonight. The birds, like the travellers sleeping inside the Boar's Head, remain settled and quiet, tucked into hedgerows and the bare branches of trees along the frosted road, conserving their own warmth against the cold, the same way the sleeping humans nearby are doing, through stillness, through huddled closeness, through the simple patient endurance that gets every living thing on this road through to whatever the coming morning eventually brings. I want to return one final time to each of the people who have shared this evening with you, before we let the night finish closing over all of them completely. Walter, who checked every door and every lock with the same careful thoroughness he has brought to this task for 11 years running, sleeps now beside the woman who has been his genuine partner in this work every bit as much as his wife, and there is a peace in that particular kind of shared labour that I think does not get talked about nearly often enough, the specific comfort of falling asleep beside someone who understands, without any need for explanation, exactly what your day actually required of you. Marjorie, whose quiet kindness toward a grieving stranger asked for nothing in return and expected nothing in return, sleeps the deep, well-earned rest of a woman who has spent every single day of this week working harder than most people work in a month, and will wake in a few hours ready to do it again without complaint, because that is simply what running a household like this one requires, and she has never once, in 11 years, resented the requiring of it. Geoffrey, worried and careful and quietly generous in his own gruff way, sleeps above his hidden coin with the particular, hard-won ease of a man who has learned, through long practice, exactly how much worry a person can sustainably carry through a night, and exactly when to finally set the rest of it down. Isabel, carrying a grief that has begun, slowly and in its own time, to soften into something bearable, sleeps in a small borrowed room, with an extra blanket offered by a stranger who understood, without needing to be told, precisely what kind of comfort she actually needed tonight. Hal and Osbert, bound together for one night only by nothing more than the simple economics of a shared bed. Sleep the easy, uncomplicated rest of working men who have walked hard and eaten well and have nothing more urgent waiting for them than tomorrow's honest labour. Edmund and Joan and their small daughter, 3 bodies curled together against an uncertain future they have chosen deliberately and are walking toward with genuine, stubborn hope, sleep pressed close for warmth and for comfort both, a small, complete family unit carrying an entire new life forward, one difficult, hopeful day at a time. And the boy and the girl, still young enough that their futures remain wide open and largely unwritten, sleep the deep, thoroughly earned rest of anyone who has worked a full honest day with their whole body, and the aunt, with her smooth worn stone still loosely held in one relaxed hand, sleeps the particular peaceful rest of someone who has made her own complicated peace, long ago now, with everything life has taken from her and everything it has, in its own quieter way, given back in return. If you drew back further still, beyond the walls of the Boar's Head entirely, out over the frosted fields and the black shapes of hedgerows and the small cluster of cottages that make up the nearby village, you would find the whole surrounding countryside settled into this same deep, patient quiet. The parish church, whose bell rang out the curfew earlier this evening, sits dark and still now, its stone walls holding the particular cold of an unheated building through the night, waiting for the small congregation that will gather there again in a few days for the next scheduled service. Cottages scattered along the lanes leading away from the main road hold their own smaller versions of tonight's inn-story. Families settled in for the night behind their own banked fires, their own barred doors, the same fundamental human need for warmth and safety being met, in 100 smaller, quieter ways, all across this same stretch of English countryside. Further along, where the road eventually widens and straightens as it approaches the larger market town 2 days from here, other travellers entirely unknown to anyone currently sleeping at the Boar's Head are settled into their own inns and lodgings for the night, living out their own versions of this same essential story, merchants worrying over their own goods, pilgrims carrying their own private griefs and hopes, families making their own difficult, hopeful transitions from one life into the next. The road connects all of it, this whole scattered web of ordinary human movement and ordinary human rest, though no single traveller on it tonight could possibly see more than the small immediate stretch directly in front of them. Navigation along a road like this one relied on landmarks rather than anything resembling a modern map, most travellers carrying no written directions at all, simply an accumulated, practical knowledge of the route built from either personal experience or careful verbal directions gathered from other travellers along the way. Distance itself was measured less often in precise units of miles, though milestones did exist along some of the better maintained routes, and more often in the practical, lived terms of days, a journey described not as so many miles but as 3 days' walk, or 2 days by cart, a measurement that accounted implicitly for the actual pace a real traveller could sustain rather than any abstract straight-line distance. Landmarks mattered enormously. A particular twisted oak at a fork in the road, a ruined chapel, the holy well Isabel will pass tomorrow, a distinctive hill visible for miles in clear weather, each one serving as a kind of waypoint passed down through generations of verbal directions. This road as reliable and as widely shared as any modern road sign, simply carried in memory and conversation rather than printed on any physical marker. Isabel's feet, sore as they are tonight, will carry her perhaps 12 or 15 miles tomorrow if the weather holds and the road stays clear, a genuinely demanding pace sustained day after day, and she has learnt over these past weeks of walking exactly how to manage that demand, when to rest briefly rather than pushing through discomfort, how to wrap a blistered heel with a bit of soft cloth and keep moving anyway, the whole quiet, practical craft of long-distance walking that becomes, with enough repetition, almost as automatic as breathing. She thinks, briefly, in the last moments before sleep finally claims her fully, of her husband again, not the illness that took him this time, but simply an ordinary afternoon years back, the two of them walking together to a neighbouring village for a market day that has long since blurred into memory alongside 100 other ordinary afternoons just like it. And there is comfort in that blurring rather than sorrow, the way an ordinary happy memory eventually loses its sharp edges and becomes something softer, something you can simply rest inside of rather than something that cuts. There was a whole quiet layer of folk belief woven around thresholds and doorways during this period, ideas that most of tonight's travellers would recognise instinctively, even if none of them could tell you exactly where the custom originated. A doorway was understood, in a great deal of folk tradition, as a genuinely liminal space, neither fully inside nor fully outside, and various small customs grew up around crossing one safely, particularly after dark. Some travellers touch the doorframe briefly on entering an unfamiliar building, a small, almost unconscious gesture of respect toward the space they are about to occupy. Others avoid stepping directly on the threshold itself, stepping cleanly over it instead, an old habit whose original reasoning has been mostly forgotten but whose practice persists anyway, the way so many small folk customs persist long after their explanations have quietly slipped away. Walter's own front door, the great oak slab, now barred securely for the night, has a small, worn groove near its base where countless travellers over 3 generations have stepped carefully over rather than on, a tiny physical record of an old belief that nobody currently living at the Boar's Head could fully explain, and yet everybody still, almost without noticing, continues to observe. Comfort objects, small physical tokens carried for reassurance rather than practical use, appear again and again among the travellers gathered here tonight, and it is worth naming a few more of them because they say something quietly true about how people have always managed the particular vulnerability of sleeping away from home. The elderly aunt has her smooth stone, Isabel has her pilgrim badge worn openly and tucked more privately into the lining of her bundle, a small scrap of her husband's own clothing, kept not for any practical purpose but simply because it still, faintly, carries something of him in its worn fibres. Harl carries a small wooden token his old master gave him on completing his apprenticeship, carved simply with the tools of the carpentry trade, a physical marker of the exact moment his own working life properly began. Geoffrey, beyond the practical chest of coin, keeps a small folded letter from his own wife back in Lincoln, read so many times over the course of this particular circuit that its creases have gone soft, containing nothing especially dramatic, simply news of home, the children, the ordinary texture of a life waiting for him at the far end of this particular journey, and he touches it sometimes, the way a person touches something simply to confirm it is still there. None of these objects do anything in any practical sense. A smooth stone does not protect anyone from harm. A soft, worn letter cannot actually shorten the distance between a travelling merchant and his family, and yet every single traveller gathered here tonight carries something like this anyway, some small physical anchor to the life they have left behind, or the person they have lost, or the identity they are still, quietly, in the process of building, and there is something worth honouring in that impulse, I think. The very human need to hold something solid in your hand when everything else about a night away from home feels, however briefly, uncertain. If you could step back outside now, into the frost-silvered yard, and look up at the Boar's Head one final time before we let this particular night finish closing over completely, you would see it exactly as it appeared many hours ago when the first travellers were still arriving off the road, and yet entirely changed too. The busy, firelit welcome of early evening now settled into something far quieter, far stiller, a building holding its breath in the particular patient way old timber buildings do through the deepest hours of night. The Boar's Head sign creaks very slightly on its iron bracket, stirred by the faintest remaining breath of wind. The thatch holds its frost in a fine, even layer across the whole sloped roof, and somewhere far off, if you listened closely enough, you might just catch the last, faint, dying rustle of that fine autumn rain finally moving on entirely, off towards some other stretch of road, some other sleeping village, leaving this one clear and cold and still beneath its scattered handful of visible stars. There is a story, one of the very few Walter tells about his own father with any real detail, that has shaped in its own quiet way how he has chosen to run this inn across his own 11 years at its head. His father, as a young man, before the Boar's Head had grown into anything like its current size, once took in a traveller during a genuinely brutal winter storm, a man with no coin at all, only a desperate need for shelter against weather that would very likely have killed him if he had been forced to continue walking through it. Walter's father housed him for 3 full nights, fed him from the household's own increasingly thin winter stores, and asked nothing in return beyond the man's word that he would pass the kindness forward some day to some other stranger in some other circumstance, whenever the opportunity presented itself. Walter never learned what became of that particular traveller, whether he ever did find occasion to pass the kindness forward as promised, and it does not in the end really matter. What matters is that his father told the story often enough, across Walter's own childhood, that it settled into him as something closer to a founding principle than a simple anecdote. The understanding that an inn, whatever else it might be, whatever profit it might reasonably expect to earn, exists first and fundamentally to meet a traveller's genuine need for shelter, and that this obligation does not entirely dissolve even when a guest's ability to pay for it runs short. Walter has, in his own 11 years, extended a version of this same grace perhaps half a dozen times. Quiet arrangements made without any particular fuss, a night's lodging offered on trust or on credit, or once or twice simply given outright to a traveller in genuine visible distress. Each time a small, private continuation of a story his own father first told him beside this exact same hearth, decades ago now, on some other cold winter night very much like the ones that will keep coming, year after year, for as long as the Boar's Head continues standing. The son, if things unfold the way they most likely will inherit this same inn some day, and with it, whether he consciously chooses to or not, this same quiet inheritance of obligation and generosity, passed down not through any written instruction, but simply through the accumulated example of watching his own parents run this place for his entire childhood, watching Marjorie offer an extra blanket to a grieving widow without ever making anything of the kindness, watching Walter extend credit to a traveller he trusted based on nothing more than instinct and long experience reading faces. And this is how such things actually get passed down, generation to generation, not through formal teaching but through simple repeated demonstration, a child absorbing, almost without noticing, the shape of the adult he will eventually become. I find something genuinely moving in that continuity, the thought that some version of tonight, this exact particular combination of firelight and shared stew and quiet kindness extended to strangers, will very likely repeat itself, in slightly different form, at this same spot on this same road, for another 3 generations at least, the boy's own children someday checking the same stable door, his own grandchildren someday offering their own version of an extra blanket to their own version of a grieving traveller passing through. History, at the scale most of us actually live it, is rarely made of grand, singular events. It is made far more often of exactly this, the same small kindnesses repeated patiently across generations, each one modest enough on its own to go almost unnoticed, and yet together forming something that genuinely deserves to be called a tradition, a whole inheritance of decency quietly handed down, hearth to hearth, across more centuries than anyone currently sleeping under this particular roof could easily count. Let me bring you back one more time into the particular sensory world of this building, because there is something worth lingering in before we let the night finish closing over it entirely. The smell of the place has settled now into its quietest, most familiar register, wood smoke gone faint and cool rather than sharp and rising, the lingering trace of stew and roasted onion softened into something more like memory than actual scent, the mustiness of straw and wool blankets in the loft, the particular clean, herbal note of lavender and meadowsweet still faintly present in the rushes underfoot. If you have ever slept in a very old building, a farmhouse perhaps, or a cottage with genuinely old bones, you may recognize something of this particular smell, the specific, layered scent of wood and smoke and cloth and time that seems to belong only to buildings that have held many years of ordinary human living inside their walls, a smell no new building, however carefully constructed, can quite replicate, because it can only be built slowly, one ordinary evening at a time, across decades. The contrast between the cold outside and the warmth held inside these timber walls feels sharper now than it did earlier in the evening, now that the frost has properly settled across the yard and the fields beyond. And there is a particular, quiet gratitude in that contrast that every sleeper in this building carries with them tonight, whether they think of it in these exact terms or not. To be warm, genuinely warm, on a night this cold, with a roof holding firm overhead, and a door barred securely against whatever the dark outside might hold, is not a small thing, was never a small thing, in a world where cold itself carried real and sometimes fatal danger for anyone caught unprotected against it. Every single sleeper here tonight, Geoffrey with his careful coin, Isabel with her quiet grief, Hal with his easy dreams of finished carpentry, Edmund and Joan with their small daughter and their cautious hope, is warm tonight because of a whole chain of decisions and labour stretching back generations, Walter's grandfather choosing this particular spot to build, Walter's father expanding it, Marjorie keeping the accounts and the herbs and the whole quiet, competent machinery of hospitality running smoothly year after year, the boy checking every lock, the daughter keeping the rushes fresh, the aunt holding her small stone and her long, settled peace. Somewhere very deep in the night, in that quiet middle stretch we spoke of earlier, Geoffrey stirs very briefly, surfacing just far enough to register, in some dim, half-conscious way, that all remains well, the stool still resting undisturbed above his hidden chest, the room still dark and quiet, and entirely as he left it, and he sinks back down almost immediately, the whole brief surfacing barely registering as a memory by morning, simply one more small, unremarkable ripple across the surface of an otherwise deep and thorough rest. Isabel in her own small room does not stir at all, sleeping more soundly than she has in weeks, the particular gift of a warm room and an extra blanket and a kind stranger's quiet understanding doing exactly the gentle work it was always meant to do. There is a particular kind of peace that settles over any place where a great many different lives have paused, briefly to rest together before scattering again in the morning toward their own separate destinations, and I think the Boar's Head, tonight, holds exactly that peace as fully and as completely as it is capable of holding it. A wool merchant worried over his coin, a widow carrying her grief carefully forward, mile by mile, toward whatever comfort a distant shrine might offer her, a young carpenter chasing the next honest job, a family gambling everything they have on the uncertain promise of better land, an innkeeper and his wife and their children, holding the whole fragile, warm machinery of shelter together night after night, year after year, asking little in return beyond a fair price and the simple, ordinary trust of strangers who have nowhere else, tonight, to lay their heads. None of it is dramatic, not really. None of it will be remembered by history in any grand or particular way, and yet all of it, taken together, forms something genuinely worth honouring, the quiet, largely unrecorded work of ordinary hospitality, repeated across countless nights just like this one, across countless roads just like this one, for as long as people have needed somewhere safe to sleep away from home. I think, if I am honest, this is part of why I keep returning to stories like this one, night after night, script after script. Not the battles, not the kings, not the grand sweeping events that fill most history books. This, the small unglamorous business of people taking care of other people, quietly, without much ceremony, expecting nothing more in return than what any of us would hope for from a stranger on a hard night. A little kindness, a little warmth, a door that locks, and a fire that holds through until morning. It is not a large thing to ask for, and it is, when you actually receive it, very nearly everything. The building itself has gone almost entirely silent now. The deepest, stillest hour of the night settled fully over every sleeping shape within its walls, every breath slow and even, every small worry finally set down, at least for these few remaining hours, in favour of simple, uncomplicated rest. The frost outside continues its own slow, patient work, and the stars continue their own slow, patient arc across the sky, and somewhere, very far off toward the eastern edge of this particular stretch of countryside, the night is already, imperceptibly, beginning the long, gradual process of eventually giving way to morning, though that morning remains, for now, still comfortably distant, still hours away, no reason at all for anyone, sleeper or listener, to hurry toward it. There is a specific old legal concept worth naming here, called the King's Peace, which extended a particular, heightened level of protection to travellers moving along the main royal highways, roads like this very one, distinct from smaller local paths and byways that fell under somewhat different, more locally variable rules. violence or robbery committed against a traveller on such a road was treated, under this doctrine, as an offence not merely against the individual victim, but against the crown itself, a breach of the king's own peace, carrying correspondingly serious legal consequences for anyone caught and convicted of it. This mattered enormously for people like Geoffrey and Isabel and Hal, all of them dependent on exactly this kind of formal road for their livelihood or their pilgrimage, and it forms one more quiet layer of the invisible protective scaffolding that made a night like tonight's relatively safe travel possible at all, alongside guild protections and innkeeper liability and local reputation and simple, accumulated community trust. The word inn itself has a surprisingly old and simple origin, tracing back through Old English to a root meaning simply a dwelling or a chamber, a place to stay, with no particular commercial connotation originally attached to it at all. Only gradually, as travel increased and organized lodging for paying strangers became a recognized trade in its own right, did the word narrow toward the specific meaning we use today, an establishment offering food and shelter to travelers for payment. Related words tell their own small stories too. Hostel and hospital and hostage all trace back, as we touched on earlier, to that same shared Latin root meaning guest or host, a whole cluster of words that seem, on the surface, to describe very different things: care for the sick, lodging for travellers, a person held against their will, and yet all of them, if you trace them back far enough, share this same underlying concept of the relationship between a host and someone under their care, whether that care is offered freely, purchased fairly, or, in the darker case of hostage, imposed by force. Language carries these old connections quietly, most of the time entirely unnoticed by the people using the words every day, and there is something rather wonderful, I think, in occasionally digging one up and holding it briefly to the light. Everything now has settled into the deepest, quietest register the night has to offer, and there is genuinely very little left to say about it that has not already been said, which is, in its own way, exactly as it should be at this particular hour. A building full of sleeping strangers, warm and safe and largely unremarkable in the grand sweep of history, doing nothing more dramatic than simply resting well through a cold autumn night, exactly as countless other buildings, full of countless other strangers, have done and will continue to do, on this same road and on 10,000 others just like it, for as long as people continue needing somewhere safe to lay their heads down at the end of a long day's travel. I want to spend just a little more time with the particular texture of rest itself before we let this night finish closing, because I think it deserves more attention than it usually gets, both in stories like this one and in ordinary daily life. Rest, real rest, the kind every single sleeper at the Boar's Head is currently experiencing, is not simply the absence of activity. It is an active process, in its own quiet way, the body and the mind both doing genuine necessary work even while appearing, from the outside, to be doing nothing at all. Muscles that carried Isabel 12 miles today are repairing themselves in the dark. Geoffrey's mind, freed from the constant low hum of daytime calculation and worry, is sorting and settling the accumulated small stresses of the day in whatever quiet way minds do this work during sleep. Edmund and Joan's small daughter is growing, in the most literal physical sense, more in these hours of deep sleep than in almost any equivalent stretch of her waking day, since growth itself concentrates heavily into exactly this kind of deep, undisturbed rest. There is something worth remembering in that, I think, particularly if you yourself have ever felt a flicker of guilt over resting, over allowing yourself a full, unhurried night's sleep, in a world that so often seems to prize constant, visible activity over quiet, necessary restoration. The travellers sleeping tonight at the Boar's Head are not wasting this night. They are doing, in the deepest and truest sense, exactly the work their bodies and minds most urgently need done, and tomorrow's walking, tomorrow's trading, tomorrow's careful new beginning on unfamiliar farmland, all of it depends entirely on the quality of rest happening right now, in this quiet, thoroughly necessary stretch of darkness. You, wherever you happen to be listening from tonight, are doing the same necessary work, whether you feel yourself drifting towards sleep already, or whether rest still feels, for now, a little further off. There is no need to rush it. There is no need to judge yourself for how quickly or how slowly it arrives. The Boar's Head took no notice, tonight, of exactly how long each of its guests took to finally drift under, whether Hal fell asleep within minutes of lying down, or whether Isabel lay awake for a good while first, working through the particular knot of grief and gratitude that Marjorie's small kindness had loosened in her. Rest arrived in its own time for every single one of them. It will arrive in its own time for you as well. The fire in the main hall has burned down now to almost nothing, a faint dull red glow beneath a thin blanket of grey ash, holding just enough warmth to keep the room from turning genuinely cold before morning, but no longer producing any real light at all. And in the kitchen, the single small rushlight Marjorie left burning in its shallow dish of water has finally, quietly, reached the natural end of its short life, the flame guttering once, twice, and then simply going out, exactly as it was always going to, needing no one to attend to it, no one to remember to put it out, the whole small, careful system of this building's nightly safety working exactly as it was designed to work, right down to its very last, smallest flame. Complete and total darkness holds the Boar's Head now, inside and out, every candle spent, every fire banked to its safest possible minimum, every door barred, every guest asleep. It is at this particular moment doing the one thing it does better than almost anything else, which is simply holding, patiently and completely, a great many tired strangers safely through the very darkest, coldest hours of an autumn night, asking nothing further of any of them until morning finally, gently, decides to arrive. Before we let this night finish its slow work entirely, I want to offer you a handful of last small facts, the kind of quiet, curious details that have no particular place earlier in the story, but that I did not want to leave out altogether because I think they round out the picture in a way that feels worth having. Innkeepers of this period, particularly ones running a house of any real size, were sometimes required to swear a formal oath before local authorities, promising to keep an honest house, to report any suspicious characters lodging under their roof, and to maintain good order among their guests, a kind of early licensing system that placed real, personal, legal weight on Walter's shoulders every single time he opened his door to a new traveller. It is easy to imagine this as pure bureaucratic burden, and in some ways it truly was, but it also gave an honest innkeeper like Walter a genuine measure of standing and protection in return, a recognised, sworn status that distinguished a proper inn from the far less regulated and often far less trustworthy alehouses and rougher lodging houses that existed alongside them on busier stretches of road. Bedbugs and fleas, while we are being fully honest about the texture of medieval sleeping life, were a genuine and fairly constant nuisance, one that no amount of dried lavender or fresh rushes ever entirely eliminated, and travellers of this period simply accepted a certain baseline of itching and scratching as an ordinary, unremarkable part of sleeping away from home, the way a modern traveller might simply accept a certain baseline of unfamiliar hotel pillow smell without giving it much further thought. Marjorie fights this particular battle harder than most innkeepers along this stretch of road, which is a real part of why the Boar's Head has kept its good reputation so consistently, but even her best efforts do not achieve anything like the total absence of small pests that a modern guest might expect as an automatic baseline. Snoring, incidentally, appears often enough in surviving medieval writing, complaints, jokes, the occasional resigned mention in a personal letter, that we can say with real confidence Hal's minor grievance about Osbert tonight belongs to an extremely long and thoroughly unbroken human tradition, stretching back at least as far as recorded writing itself, and very probably considerably further than that. Some things, it turns out, have simply never changed, no matter how many centuries separate one sleeper from the next. There is one more small story I want to tell you before we finish, a short one, about a particular guest who stayed at the Boar's Head some years back, an old travelling scholar, a man who made his modest living copying and occasionally composing short works for wealthier patrons, and who stopped here for a single night on his way toward a monastery some days further along the road. He stayed up later than most guests, Walter remembers, talking with the elderly aunt by the fire long after everyone else had gone up to bed, and in the morning, before he left, he wrote out a short verse for her on a spare scrap of parchment, thanking her in careful, formal language for the warmth and kindness of the house. The aunt still has that scrap of parchment, kept folded carefully inside the same small chest where she keeps her few other treasured possessions, and she takes it out sometimes, on quiet evenings, and reads it over, not because the words themselves are especially remarkable, but because it remains, all these years later, a small, tangible proof that a single ordinary night's hospitality once mattered enough to a passing stranger that he wanted to leave something behind in thanks for it. That, I think, is really the whole heart of everything we have spent tonight exploring together. Not the wool trade, interesting as it is, not the legal architecture of innkeeper liability, or the folklore of thresholds, or the particular chemistry of frost on a clear night. Just that, the plain, thoroughly ordinary fact that when strangers offer each other genuine warmth and genuine shelter, something real passes between them, something that outlasts the single night it was offered in, something worth remembering, worth writing down on a spare scrap of parchment, worth carrying forward, carefully folded, for years and years afterward. I like to imagine sometimes what the next morning holds for each of these travellers, though we do not need to walk through it in any real detail tonight, only to hold it gently in mind as a kind of quiet promise waiting on the other side of this darkness. Geoffrey will wake before full light, as he always does, check his chest one final time out of long habit rather than genuine worry, settle his reckoning with Marjorie, and continue his slow, careful circuit toward the next market town, carrying with him, as he always does, a little of Walter's news and a little of whatever news he picked up here in turn, ready to pass it along further down the road. Isabel will rise, fold the extra blanket carefully, thank Marjorie with real warmth rather than mere politeness, and continue walking toward her shrine, her 2 candles waiting patiently for her somewhere ahead, her grief a little lighter than it was yesterday, though not gone, never entirely gone, simply carried a little more easily than before. Hal will wake to Osbert's final morning grumble about his own snoring, laugh it off the way he laughed it off the night before, and continue on toward his carpentry job, his hands already looking forward, in their own quiet way, to the honest work waiting for them. Edmund and Joan will wake their small daughter gently, share a simple breakfast, and continue the last stretch of their journey toward a new farm and a new life that neither of them can yet fully picture, but both of them have chosen, together, to walk toward anyway. And the Boar's Head itself will do what it has always done, what it will keep doing for years and years to come: air out the loft, sweep fresh rushes across the hall floor, restock the larder, mend whatever small thing needs mending, and prepare, by evening, to welcome an entirely new set of tired strangers off the road, offering them the exact same quiet warmth it offered tonight's travellers, the same fair price, the same careful attention to locks and shutters and banked fires, the same unremarkable, essential kindness that has kept this particular inn's reputation solid across 3 full generations, and will in all likelihood keep it solid for a good many more. There is a particular sound, I think, that belongs uniquely to a large old building settling into the very deepest part of its night. One final small thing worth noticing before we let this story rest completely. It is not any single sound exactly. It is the accumulated, layered hum of many small sounds happening at once, so quiet and so constant that the ear stops registering them as separate events at all and simply absorbs them, together, as a kind of ambient texture, the particular felt presence of a building that is old enough and lived in enough to have its own steady, wordless voice. The faint tick of cooling timber, the occasional soft settle of thatch shifting almost imperceptibly under its thin coat of frost, the distant, muffled rhythm of Osbert's snore, filtered now through 2 closed doors into something closer to a heartbeat than an actual sound. If you listened for long enough, patiently enough, you might start to feel that this whole building is, in its own slow, wooden way, breathing along with everyone sleeping inside it. One long, unhurried exhale stretched out across the entire remaining length of the night. Marjorie's aunt, in the last waking moment before her own sleep finally, fully claims her, thinks briefly, as she often does on quiet nights like this one, about how many such nights this same hearth has now witnessed, how many tired strangers have settled here exactly as tonight's travellers have settled, carrying their own particular mix of worry and hope and grief and quiet gladness through this same worn front door, and how the building itself, patient and unchanging in its essential shape, even as the individual faces passing through it change endlessly, seems, in some small way she has never quite found the right words for, to hold all of it, gently, the accumulated weight of every single night it has ever offered shelter, folded quietly into its old timber bones. And then even that thought softens, loosens, drifts, the way every thought eventually does at the very edge of sleep, and the aunt, too, finally lets go entirely, her hand relaxed around her small worn stone, her breathing settling into the same slow, even rhythm as everyone else sleeping around her in this warm, thoroughly ordinary old inn. But that is all still hours away, gentle and unhurried on the other side of a long, restful night, and there is no need for either of us to rush toward it. For now, this is simply a building full of sleeping strangers, warm and safe under an old thatched roof, resting through the coldest, darkest stretch of an English autumn night, while frost settles quietly over the yard outside and stars turn their slow, patient arc overhead, indifferent and beautiful and entirely unbothered by whether anyone happens to be awake to watch them. If you are still with me, and I suspect that if you have made it this far, you very likely are not really, not in the way that matters, then let yourself follow these travellers the rest of the way down. Let your own breathing slow the way theirs has slowed. Let your own shoulders loosen the way Isabel's loosened that first evening at Marjorie's small unasked-for kindness. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight either, no door you need to check, no reckoning you need to settle before morning, just this quiet, ordinary miracle of a warm bed at the end of a long day, waiting patiently for you the same way it waited, all those centuries ago, for a wool merchant and a grieving widow, and a young carpenter, and a family beginning again, all of them strangers to each other, all of them, for one single night, held safely under the very same roof. There is one last thought I want to leave you with, and then I will let you rest properly, without any further interruption from me. Every single detail we have moved through tonight, the shared beds, the curfew bell, the wool merchant's careful chest, the widow's quiet grief, the family beginning again on unfamiliar land, all of it happened, in some form very close to what I have described, on countless real nights across a great many real centuries, lived by real people whose actual names have mostly been lost to us now, swallowed by time the way most ordinary lives eventually are. Geoffrey and Isabel and Walter and Marjorie are not any single specific person drawn from any single specific record. They are something closer to a composite, built carefully from the accumulated evidence of how people in their positions actually lived, actually travelled, actually slept and worried and hoped in this particular period of English history. And yet I think there is a real kind of truth in them anyway, a truth that does not depend on any one of them having existed exactly as described, because the underlying human experience they carry, the vulnerability of sleeping away from home, the relief of finding genuine kindness among strangers, the quiet courage of walking toward an uncertain future anyway, belongs to no single person and to all of us at once, then and now, across every single century in between. That is in the end why I keep telling stories like this one, night after night. Not because I can promise you every single detail is precisely, perfectly accurate, down to the last thread of wool or the last drop of ale, though I do try genuinely to get as close to that accuracy as careful research allows. I tell them because the underlying feeling, the ordinary, universal human need for shelter and warmth, and a little unasked for kindness from a stranger, has not changed at all, not even slightly, across all these centuries, and I think there is something worth resting inside of, on a difficult night, in knowing that you are not the first person, and will not be the last, to find real comfort in exactly that. One very last image, before I let you go entirely. Picture the yard outside, one final time, silvered over completely now, with frost, utterly still, utterly quiet, the boar's head sign hanging motionless on its bracket, the covered cart standing patient beside the stable, every window dark, every shutter closed. Picture the road beyond it, empty in both directions, curving away into darkness under a sky slowly wheeling its scattered stars toward whatever hour will eventually bring the first grey suggestion of dawn. And picture, tucked safely inside all of that stillness, this one small timbered building, holding a dozen tired strangers gently through the coldest hours of an autumn night, asking nothing more of any of them than the simple willingness to rest. That is where we leave them tonight, not at any dramatic turning point, not at any grand resolution, simply here in the quiet middle of an ordinary, extraordinary night, warm and safe and thoroughly deeply asleep, and that, I think, is exactly the right place to leave a story like this one. Not every tale needs a tidy ending delivered in daylight. Some of them are better left resting, exactly like this, in the dark, unfinished in the gentlest possible way, waiting patiently for a morning that will arrive in its own good time, long after we ourselves have already drifted off to follow them there. There is a kind of gratitude that belongs specifically to the middle of the night, different from the brighter, more obvious gratitude of daylight hours, quieter, less examined, closer to a simple physical fact than to any conscious feeling. It is the gratitude a tired body feels for a warm blanket without ever needing to name it as gratitude at all. It is the gratitude Isabel's shoulders expressed, easing that small fraction of an inch, long before her waking mind had caught up to what her body already understood. It is the gratitude every single sleeper at the Boar's Head is carrying right now, wordless, unexamined, simply present in the easy rhythm of their breathing, in the loosened set of their hands, in the deep, unguarded stillness of bodies that have, for these few hours at least, nothing left to guard against. I think that quiet, wordless gratitude is worth naming once, clearly, before we finish, because it so rarely gets named at all, drowned out, usually, by louder and more obvious feelings that arrive in daylight and demand more attention. But it is there, underneath everything, every single night, in every warm bed, anywhere in the world. It is there in yours right now, too, whether you have noticed it yet or not. Somewhere in the loft, one last small sound settles into place before true silence finally takes over completely, the faint sleepy murmur of the little girl shifting once more against her mother's side, a wordless fragment of comfort rather than any real waking, and then nothing more, only breath, only warmth, only the patient wooden hush of a building doing exactly what it was built to do. Outside, the frost holds its silvered watch a while longer, and the stars continue their slow, unhurried turn overhead, and the whole sleeping countryside around the Boar's Head, village and field and hedgerow and road, rests in that same deep, unbothered quiet, waiting, without any urgency at all, for whatever the coming day will eventually bring. Rest well. Let the whole quiet weight of this old house settle around you too, its timbers patient, its fire banked, its every door held firmly shut against the dark. Somewhere far off, past the edge of hearing, the night itself seems to hold its breath a moment longer, patient and unhurried, in no rush at all to become anything other than exactly what it already is, content simply to go on being dark and cold and quiet, for as long as any of its sleepers still need it to be. And so, at last, quietly and completely, it finally does. The fire has gone dark now, the candle has burned itself all the way down. The frost keeps its slow, silent watch over the yard, and somewhere above it, the stars keep theirs, and the whole quiet, timbered shape of the Boar's Head settles more deeply still into the particular, patient stillness of the very last hours before dawn, hours that belong to no one in particular, hours that ask nothing of anyone at all beyond the simple, complete surrender of finally, fully letting go. Sleep well tonight, wherever you are. Whatever road brought you here, whatever weight you carried in through your own door this evening, you can set it down now, the same way Geoffrey set down his worry, the same way Isabel set down her grief, if only for these few dark, quiet hours. The door is barred, the fire is banked, the whole house and everyone in it is finally, completely at rest. Good night, truly, and sleep well. I will see you again next time, with another old door, another quiet fire, another story waiting patiently on the other side of it, whenever you happen to need it most.